Hello, today on my channel you will hear an amazing story about life. I hope you enjoy this story. This one struck me to the core. Honestly, I still can't forget it. Enjoy watching.
When Cassandra, a young midwife, arrived for her regular shift in the labor ward of the hospital, she saw a commotion. A nurse ran past with a pile of linen. Another brought a box. In the changing room, Cassandra asked a shift who was on her way home. "What's all the commotion over there? Everyone running around today?" "It happened that hasn't happened yet," she replied. "The VIP palace is being prepared. Some rich man's daughter is having a baby, so they're putting things in order." "There's always order," Cassandra said, surprised. "It might be orderly for us, but for people like that, you have to make things special. Daddy's already come and looked round, and he's brought the linen and the curtains and told me to replace them with my own." "What's that for? How long is she going to stay here?" "That's the thing, a long time. She's supposed to be over a month away from giving birth. She's supposed to have twins. So the father decided to put her down. You never know. So you better keep your eyes peeled for any gnats that might land on her. That super daddy will blow everyone away. They're bringing the lady in today. Get ready to meet her." "Well, we've never had flies here. We'll take everything else." "What's the big deal?" Cassandra replied and went about her duties. It really didn't bother her much to hear that they would soon have a new woman in labor who needed special attention. It's a natural birth. Twins are not always, but often a special occasion for both mother and children, and it may cause some concern, but here's the girl's personality. Who cares whose daughter she is or what curtains are hung in our room? Cassandra had grown up in an orphanage and wasn't used to being flattered or special to anyone. She knew that some of her colleagues were angry at the admission of such special patients. Some of them, especially relatives, are afraid of them. But some, on the contrary, are delighted and hope to earn some benefit for themselves by their obsequious behavior. Perhaps they hope to receive a special payment, maybe even a promotion to a higher level. Cassandra could hear one of the nurses talking. That pregnant woman's daddy is some kind of banker or businessman, and he's not married. They say that girls, keep yourself in shape when he comes, and he will probably come often to check on his daughter and see how she is being cared for. None of these questions occupied Cassandra much. When a special patient was brought in, she went out to greet her as usual, friendly and kindly, but without too much favoritism. Besides, the girl was not a young lady at all, but very sweet and simple, not at all trying to put herself above others. Had it not been for the super dad who brought his daughter, she would have been indistinguishable from the usual incoming laboring women. Her name was Margaret, and it was Cassandra who had to escort her into the room. "It's very nice here," Margaret said, folding her hands on her big belly, "and the curtains are so pretty. I hope I'm going to be all right. I'm expecting twins. You know, I'm so scared of childbirth." "Oh, really? It's going to be great. You don't have any problems, as I understand. And our doctors are very attentive and qualified. Besides, twins are not that rare. So it's a common thing for us. Recently, a woman gave birth to a girl and a boy, and everything went very well. I'm sure it won't be worse for you." "What am I going to do in the ward alone? It's boring." "Well, at least there's a telly, it works. And if you have a moment, please come and see me. Because I'm really alone, maybe bored, maybe even scared. So we can chat. Tell me something?" Cassandra promised to visit the girl. She wished her a pleasant rest and went to the head doctor's office, where the patient's father, Mr. Winston, had already assembled all the staff. Well, he wasn't exactly the modest type. "I demand that my daughter be given the utmost attention. She must have someone on staff with her at all times. Unfortunately, I can't be here 24 hours a day. I have a job to do, and I'm a man. Margaret has no mother, unfortunately. So I'm relying on you. And be warned, if anything goes wrong, I'll know it was one of you." "This is not the place to talk," said the worried father threateningly. "Margaret is my only daughter, and I will spare no money for her." Everyone from the head doctor to the nurse assured Mr. Winston that his daughter would be fine. They wouldn't let anything bad happen. In fact, their maternity hospital was a model medical facility with the best equipment and the most qualified doctors. So the nurses were looking at each other, fixing their hair and trying to catch the eye of the man they already considered to be an enviable groom. For some reason, he suddenly singled out Cassandra, standing modestly by the door. He looked at her carefully and said, "You, young lady, are a doctor midwife. Very good. Please see to my daughter. It's very important that she has a reliable person by her side at all times." "Well, of course, I'll be there on my shift, of course. All our doctors and nurses are excellent. You can trust anyone." "You inspire the most confidence in me," the man said. "So if you have the opportunity, please give my daughter more attention. And of course, it will all be paid for." When the patient's father was finally escorted out, the head doctor sighed and said to the staff, "Colleagues, such a comrade is not to be trifled with. And by the way, it's not an ordinary case. I think the children will be fine. But I don't like the patient's health. We'll have to do some more examinations and take all measures to prevent any really unpleasant mishaps." "So you're lucky, Cassandra," one of the nurses said as they left the room. "What made you trust him in the first place? If everything goes well, they'll thank you for sure." "Well, then I'll owe you cake and champagne," Cassandra said. She thought to herself, "But they in cahoots, both of them, father and daughter. It's like I don't have any other patience. I can't leave everyone and sit all day with this treasure." However, she did not dislike the patient who was about to give birth to twins. She really hoped it would go smoothly. She didn't want anything to go wrong with Margaret. It wasn't because she was afraid of her father or wanted some kind of reward. It was just that at first sight she had somehow taken a liking to the girl. Meanwhile, the whole staff was discussing both the rich man and his daughter every spare minute. One of the nurses remarked, "Isn't it strange that the father is so excited and no husband in sight? First of all, in my opinion, he should worry about his beloved, or she without a husband somewhere fatting twins." "I don't think so. Her father must have found her a good-looking fiancé. She's probably traveling abroad. Rich people do it all the time. They study and work," suggested the nurse. "Why didn't Daddy say anything about it? About his mother?" "No, I even heard that his wife ran away when the daughter was very young. You're such a gossip collector. Should a person like that report to you where her husband is and where her mother is?" The other colleagues dismissed her. Cassandra was also a little surprised by this fact. She had actually started coming into Margaret's room frequently to ask how she was doing, how she was viewing, or just to chat. They had hit it off at once, and both felt drawn to each other. But never once did Margaret mention that she had a husband somewhere out there. She had mentioned some personal difficulties in a half hint of conversation, but she had cut it short, and Cassandra had been hesitant. After all, it was possible that there was some mystery, perhaps even unhappiness, hidden in it. Having such a caring father was great, but it was hardly a substitute for personal happiness. During another night watch, Cassandra noticed something that not only surprised her, but frightened her. Before going to bed, she went into Margaret's room, just to say goodnight as usual. The girl was already in bed, covered with a blanket. She'd switched off the telly and looked ready to go to sleep. "Did I wake you up?" "I just came by to say goodnight and ask if everything was all right," Cassandra said with a smile. "I'm fine, Cassandra. Thank you for caring. I was feeling drowsy, so I decided to go to bed early." "You have a good night, too," Margaret said with a smile. Her wish did not come true. The duty that night was very difficult. Cassandra could not lie down. She could not sit down for a minute. At one point, running from one room to another, she noticed someone leaving the ward, and it couldn't be. No one came out at night, especially since it was probably one of the patients. It was already an alarming signal, because it happened that women who had given birth ran away, leaving their babies and not even writing a cancellation. But at that time, there seemed to be no one capable of such an act in the ward. And women who had just given birth or were about to give birth were not at all inclined to run away. However, Cassandra looked in all the wards. No, all the patients were in place. "I guess it's just me," she thought, and went about her urgent business. She would have forgotten about the incident had she not noticed Margaret slipping into her room in the early morning while the patients were still asleep, and she was filling in the logbook. And then again, out of the corner of her eye, dressed as if she were going out. Now this was serious, and it was hard to write off the incident as something she had imagined. It was already an emergency, given the girl's personality, especially her father's. Cassandra got up to go straight to Margaret, to ask her what was wrong, and to reproach her for risking the health and lives of not only her own children, but also her own, not to mention the fact that the whole staff could be caught for it. And for some reason she didn't go in, didn't ask about anything. When she got home after work, she kept thinking about what made Margaret, no longer just a patient but a close friend, run away from the hospital at night, and how she could help. And then she decided not to guess, but to find out it was the only way she could possibly prevent serious trouble. But it was somehow uncomfortable to ask, i.e., to pry into her private life. The only other option was to follow her when she was away on her next tour of duty. Cassandra said goodnight to Margaret, as she always did, and went about her bout. This time the watch promised to be a quiet one. Cassandra was not alone. Another midwife was on duty with her, and she had told her that she might be away for an hour on personal business. She didn't go into details, just nodded understandingly. Cassandra settled down at her desk with her head in her hands, so that she could pretend to be asleep when Margaret decided to leave her room. There was no doubt in Cassandra's mind that this would happen, and she kept her eyes on her door. Soon Margaret did indeed come out and looked round and quickly headed for the exit. Cassandra just as quietly, surreptitiously followed. The street was deserted and thankfully dark. It was dark enough to keep the fugitive mare of Margaret out of sight. The latter, by the way, behaved cautiously. Like an experienced spy, she walked quickly, also avoiding open places and constantly looking round. So Cassandra had to be on her guard. What a detective, she thought. Let's hope she doesn't get a bad start. It happens. Excitement, fast walking. So much for giving birth in a back alley. That's when the father will be happy and strangle me for paying such attention to his daughter. Just then she saw a dark, intimidating-looking figure emerge from the back alley toward Margaret. Cassandra wanted to scream, to rush to her aid, but she didn't have time. Margaret herself rushed to the man, who looked more like a homeless man or a vagrant. They embraced, kissed, then, holding hands, walked away, sat down on a bench, and began to talk. Cassandra was left to wait in a secluded place. It was still necessary to see when the patient would return, though it was clear. The rich father had forbidden his daughter to date a poor man. But the girl doesn't want to bend up and soon the children will be born. And then what? Maybe Margaret hopes her father will soften after that. Let them be together. Margaret's a good girl, not like her father at all. She got together with some poor bastard and continues to date him no matter what. And then with the children, no doubt, of this tramp. They'll probably run away from home, or their father will forgive them, accept them. They're not strangers. That's what Cassandra thought of this romantic story. Margaret decided not to say anything for the time being. Let things be as they were for the time being, even if it was a fleeting happiness. But having wrested it from cruel fate, what could she, Cassandra, do to help? Nothing, except to turn a blind eye to their dates. But a few days later, things got even more confused. Cassandra overheard Mr. Winston talking to the superintendent. "You'll forgive me for being so demanding, but I'm worried about my daughter. You see, she's the only one I've got, and I'm the only one she's got. There is no mother. Her fiancé disappeared 6 months ago without a trace. A fine young man, businessman from a good family. We loved each other so much. And suddenly, what a nightmare. What about the police?" exclaimed the superintendent. "Yes, you might say they're not looking for him. That's the whole tale. It's probably the so-called reverse side of the business. He crossed someone's path by youth or stupidity. They found his car somewhere outside of town. That's all. That leaves my Margaret alone. There may be hope, but..." Cassandra was at a loss. She had already painted a slender picture in her mind. And now it turns out that there was also some sort of fiancé and she and Margaret were in love. And who, then, was this tramp? Whose children are about to be born? And what if the father finds out about this man Margaret is meeting in secret? Cassandra decided not to guess any more, but to ask Margaret directly. In the evening she went into her room and said without preamble, I'm sorry, Margaret, but I'm aware of your nocturnal activities. Believe me, I'm not asking out of curiosity, although there is that too. But the important thing is that I and the entire hospital staff are responsible for you. Oh, Cassandra, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, I wanted to go out and get some out, so I didn't ask to go. I know you wouldn't let me go. Don't. You can go out in the hospital garden during the day, but at night you're running around the city and meeting someone. If you don't care about doctors, then realize it's dangerous for you and the kids. Who is this man you're running to? Margaret turned away, trying to hide the tears that had returned to her eyes, and Cassandra felt sorry for her. She spoke more softly, sympathetically. And I've told you everything I've seen and heard. I've already written a whole novel. And I was wondering if there was anything I could do to help you. And then suddenly it turns out there was a fiancé. I'm sorry if you think I'm prying, but I probably am. But believe me, it's not just curiosity, it's concern. I believe you. I don't know why, but lately you, Cassandra, are probably the only person I trust. So I'll tell you, the man you saw is Thomas. I've loved him for a long time. He's not homeless. He's not a vagrant. But he doesn't have his own flat now. And he's an orphan. You said you grew up in an orphanage too. Well, you know, they probably gave him a flat after he was discharged. But then some people cheated him. I don't know how, but he was left without a place to live. How he's living in a hostel for workers, practically a barracks. Well, at least he has a roof over his head. He works at a construction site. He has a profession at all. And he's a good man. But you understand there's no hope that my dad will agree to marry me off to him. But I can't live without him. I fell in love. Then I found out we were having a baby. But I didn't realize that there would be two of them at once. And how will you tell your father? And I was scared to even imagine. But he must have guessed it himself. He didn't say anything, but he found me some fiancés from our circle, as they say. Jack, and he said, you'll marry him, that's all. He doesn't talk much at all. Jack didn't mind. He was courting me, and I didn't know what to do. But as luck would have it, it's a sin to say so. But Jack disappeared. They even say he might have died. But I don't really care. Now it's assumed that my children will be Jack's, but they're not. Their father is Thomas. How are you going to tell your father it's not true? And how are you going to live with your lover anyway? Cassandra asked. I don't know. I'll probably confess to my father. But what will he do to me? Will he kill me? And Thomas too, if he throws me out of the house. I'm not afraid of that. I'll leave. We'll live with Thomas and the children if my father doesn't take them away, because you can expect anything from him. But I don't think that's likely. Yes, your dad is a bossy man, but I don't think he's cruel. Especially as he loves you very much. So I wish you'd confess to him. That's easy for you to say, though it's not as hard to do as it seems. You see, it's not that I'm afraid. I don't want to disappoint him. I mean, he's always been both father and mother to me, for he cared for me, hoped for me, made plans for me. I'll probably confess later when the children are born. Perhaps I should have told you sooner. And Margaret, having confessed it, cried helplessly. Will the rich cry too and bring the poor to tears, thought Cassandra, who was deeply moved by the story. Clearly, there was nothing she could do to help, except to sympathize, to comfort her friend. Margaret went into labor a little early. During the examination, it turned out that the girl had a narrow pelvis, and she was prescribed a caesarean, and everything seemed to go quite well. The children, 2 boys, appeared quite healthy, but for the young mother the labor proved to be too hard. She was in a serious condition. But Thomas was the first to come to her. How he knew what had happened is unknown. Maybe he sensed it. Luckily, Cassandra was the first to meet him. She recognized him, gave him shoe covers and a dressing gown, and took him to Margaret at her own risk, and left him alone with her. But the lovers didn't have much time to talk. Almost immediately, Mr. Winston rushed into the hospital to be told that he had 2 grandchildren. Bursting into his daughter's room and seeing Thomas, he went into a frenzy. Who the hell is this? Why is he here? Well, let him in. Where's the head doctor? What is this outrage? I'm the father of your grandchildren, Thomas said simply. What else are you going to tell me here? Margaret's father exclaimed. Don't, Dad, said his daughter to him in a weak voice. It's the truth. I've been in love with Thomas for a long time. He's a father. And we never had anything with Jack. I'm sorry. Oh God, he sank powerlessly into a chair. Margaret, you've been deceiving me all this time. What do I do about it now? I don't know. Margaret spoke evidently out of her last strength. But I'm asking you very much. Don't separate us. I can't live without him. Yes, all right. Live with whoever you like, but just live. How are you feeling, daughter? So look, go away for now, all of you. I want to talk to her. And you, Thomas, don't go far away. We'll talk later. Don't worry, there won't be any complaints against you. Father was alone with Margaret, but she was very weak, and their relationship was not long. The daughter, holding his hand and looking pleadingly into his eyes, only had time to apologize for the deception and to say that Thomas was a good but unhappy man. Mr. Winston promised that everything would be all right. Thomas would live with them. Soon the doctor came in and escorted him out. Do anything, any money, as long as she is alive, said the father, seriously alarmed at his daughter's condition. We are doing everything possible. A professor from another clinic has also been called in. There is hope. Mr. Winston left the room, looked round, saw Thomas. Well, Pops, congratulations. Yes, Margaret has confessed to me. It's a pity it wasn't sooner. However, what's to say about that? I hope all will be well with you. I want you to come home with me. Where will I put you? We'll make a man out of you. Thomas went to his sweetheart's house, and Mr. Winston kept his promise. He found out what problems prevented his future son-in-law from leading a normal life, began to restore his documents, got him a job. Although his main concern was, of course, his daughter. He constantly kept in touch with the hospital, worried and hoped for the best. He didn't even tell anyone that Jack had been found. He hadn't died, hadn't even disappeared anywhere. The whole thing was an imitation of some kind of tragedy. Mr. Winston, not yet knowing that Jack had nothing to do with his grandchildren, hired a detective who was able to find the groom. It turned out that he had disappeared for a reason, but had taken a substantial sum of money from his future father-in-law and disappeared with it. He was a gambler. He'd run up huge debts. He hoped to win back, lost everything, and now had to hide in a neighboring town. Turns out he wasn't a businessman either. His parents were quite wealthy people, but they died, and their offspring rather quickly squandered all the fortune. By marrying Margaret, he hoped to improve his situation, but he ruined it for good. It's too late for that. Mr. Winston thought of punishing the deceiver. But then Margaret's misfortune happened, and they had no time for that. A few days later, despite the best efforts of the doctors, the young mother died. Mr. Winston, unable to come to terms with the terrible grief, hired independent experts who found that the doctors were not at fault. That is, there was no one to punish. Weep for your daughter and move on with your life, the expert told him. I realized that after what happened, this is almost impossible. But still rejoice in the fact that you have been given 2 wonderful grandchildren to take care of. Yes, of course, said the grief-stricken grandfather. After Margaret's funeral, her twin children, Michael and David, were moved into his home. Mr. Winston approached Sandra and said, I know Margaret came closest to you, and as I said, you inspire confidence in me as well. Would you be willing to move into my home and be a nanny for my grandchildren? You have a medical degree, good experience, and you already know the children. Where else would I find such a nanny? Everything will be new to them. I have a job. Cassandra was surprised, and she liked the offer. She felt that by caring for Margaret's newborn, she would be doing one last favor for a late friend. So you quit your job. I'll tell the head doctor not to torture you with time off work. And don't worry about the salary. It will be much higher than what you get now. All you'll have to do is look after the children. You won't have to run the household. I've got a good housekeeper who does a great job. But 2 babies is just too much for her to handle. Cassandra agreed, and not because of the salary. And since she had to look after the twins around the clock, she moved into Mr. Winston's house, and Thomas lived there too. He'd already got a good job. He had proved himself well, and was no longer recognizable as the vagabond of yesterday. Back home, he was always with the children, learning from Cassandra. I hope I'm not disturbing you, he asked. I just want to be a good father to my children. I never knew my mother myself, and I understand how hard it is to live without parents. At least let them have a father. When they found out that Cassandra was also from the orphanage, they talked a lot about their past. Neither remembered her parents. although Cassandra had been in the orphanage when she was 2 years old and knew from the stories of her carers that her mother had abandoned her. Thomas, on the other hand, knew nothing about himself at all. I was given my first and last name at the orphanage, so I, a foundling, don't even have a chance to find my parents. Have you ever tried to find your mum? When I was little, I was very worried. I didn't understand why my mum did this to me. And when I grew up, I decided there was no point. If she refused, she refused. And for what reason? That's pretty obvious. I wasn't wanted. And I suppose she wanted to get married, or something like that. Why should I know that? It's clear enough. Since she was such a woman, perhaps I'm lucky I refused at all. Otherwise, I'd have got rid of her when I was pregnant. In the orphanage, well, I can't say it was bad. I was able to study, get a good profession. And with a mother like that, I don't know what would have happened to me, Cassandra replied. 6 months passed after Margaret's death. The pain of loss had not quite subsided, but had dulled, especially since there was always someone to distract herself with. David and Michael grew up to be wonderful children. Every day they delighted their grandfather, their father, and their nanny with new achievements. Cassandra, often talking to Thomas, had already realized that a new feeling had awakened in her heart, but she did not let it go. Margaret had only recently passed away. How could anyone think of taking her place? And after realizing that Thomas had a thing for her too, the girl thought about leaving this house. But how could she leave the little ones? One day, Mr. Winston was visited by his business partner from out of town. The host organized a dinner party to which Thomas and Cassandra were invited, almost as relatives. And then the unexplainable happened. On seeing Thomas, the guest suddenly turned pale, and when he woke up, he exclaimed in amazement, "Arthur." "I am Thomas," replied the young man, understanding nothing. Mr. Winston was also puzzled. The guest, after puffing a little and recovering from his astonishment, began his story. It turned out that Thomas was an exact replica of his nephew Arthur, who had recently died in a car accident. It couldn't have been a coincidence, but there was no mysticism about it either. It was explained quite simply. Arthur was also one of a pair of twins. But it was still after they were born right away that it happened. The culprit, I believe, is Ben, my brother, the father of the twins. He had a mistress. I don't know how he came up with it. A young, beautiful wife. And this mistress hoped to marry him, but he wouldn't. Though he must have promised, lied about something. In short, the story is banal. And this mistress finds out that his wife is not sick at all, and he is not going to break up with her. Moreover, she's pregnant. And then it starts. First the woman went crazy. I don't know, maybe she's always been like that. At first she just spoilt their lives. She called, came, made scandals, hysterics. Anyway, they put her in a psychiatric hospital. But not for long, because apparently she wasn't that crazy. She was released just as the twins were born. And somehow she managed to kidnap one of them and escaped with him. Of course they looked for her and the baby, but they never found her. They found her a year later. But she was dead, jumped off a bridge. And where did she take the child? We don't know. They thought she must have killed her. But we didn't really settle down, we just accepted it. There's only one son left, Arthur. And you, Thomas, must be the other one. That psychopathic woman couldn't bear to kill a child. She put him in an orphanage. Yes, I was abandoned, as the story goes. Then there was no note, nothing. So there was no chance of finding the parents. Not now either, because Arthur died with them. It was a terrible accident. Besides them, 4 others are gone, Thomas replied. And the brother and his wife and nephew were the only relatives. Except for his wife and 2 sons, but the brother is still part of my family. At least I have a nephew now. After this was learnt, business negotiations were out of the question. I had to figure out how to deal with Thomas. It turned out that he was not only the son of the dead businessmen, but also the heir to their considerable fortune. Mr. Winston was astonished. He thought he'd taken in a homeless, almost homeless man. Turns out he's the son of such men, his partner's nephew, and possibly a wealthy heir. We'll have to document all this, of course. We'll have to take some tests for that. But a DNA test is no problem. I'm not going to betray my brother's memory, and I'll give him everything his son is entitled to. And I'll introduce you, Thomas, to my family, so you are the closest relative we have. Now it was Thomas's turn to marvel. Who would have thought it? So I have an uncle, some cousins. I never imagined such a thing. I thought I'd never know who I was or where I came from, and now I'll know something about my mom and dad. Turns out I wasn't abandoned. What do you mean abandoned? They remembered you till the last day of your life, but they never hoped to find you. It's a pity they died without knowing anything. Will you go to town with your uncle now? Will you live there? Mr. Winston asked. Oh no, will you? Where am I going to go? I have a family here, a job, children, objected Thomas, while looking at Cassandra. Now, of course, I'll go to the graves and meet your family, but not right away. Everyone was surprised to congratulate Thomas on finding his family. Cassandra rejoiced too, though she was saddened too. Lucky you, Thomas, she said when it was just the two of them the next day. And I don't seem to be getting anything like that. How shall I put it? Lucky, no parents. No brother either. Of course, I'm glad that I have relatives, that I can at least find out about my mom and dad, but I can't live near them. I mean, we can't see each other often. I can't leave the children. Take them away from Mr. Winston. I can't. And away from you, Cassandra. He took the girl's hand, but she yanked it back and stopped him. Don't, Thomas, and glanced at Margaret's portrait with the mourning ribbon. Thomas understood, embarrassed. And when Cassandra came out, he looked at the lovely face for a long time and thought, I'm sorry, my love, you're in the past, and we're moving on with our lives. I will never forget you. Our children won't allow it, but life goes on. In the evening, Cassandra tucked the little ones in, made sure everything was in order, and with a clear conscience went to bed. It had been a tiring day, so she couldn't even read. As soon as I opened the book, I felt my eyes closing and sleep taking over. However, it was not possible to fall asleep soundly enough. Her sleep was professionally responsive, and Cassandra heard the twins cry. The cry was not hungry or cranky, but frightened. What happened to them in there? She thought anxiously and jumped up, throwing on her dressing gown, and what she saw in the nursery chased away the remnants of sleep. Some obviously unfamiliar person was placing the babies in a carrier. What are you doing? Stop, she shouted, not afraid to scare the children. The most important thing in this situation was to save them, probably from their captor. Cassandra rushed towards him, intending not to let the infants be carried away. But the unknown man wasn't about to give up either. He turned and quietly whispered something under his breath, then swung his fist at the fleeing girl's jaw. The Cassandra staggered, but managed to stay on her feet. Realizing that she couldn't do it alone, and the intruder's intentions were serious, she screamed with all her might. Help! Thomas, Mr. Winston, Lucy called the police. You shut up, the man shouted at the top of his voice. He grabbed a desk lamp off the table and swung it at Cassandra. Apparently he wanted to hit her in the head, but she dodged. The blow slid across her shoulder, tearing the sleeve of her dressing gown and probably hurting her skin. But the girl didn't care about that. The main thing was to save the children. The kidnapper, in the process of the scuffle, moved away from them, and she stood between him and the carrier, in which the babies were already lying, frightened, screaming because of the commotion. And from the corridor came shouting and stomping. Help arrived just in time. Both men ran into the room at the same time shouting. What happened? What happened to the children? Cassandra, who is it? What a surprise, Jack. A new name was shouted by Mr. Winston, who recognized the kidnapper after they had already twisted him. It's Margaret's ex-fiancés, said the landlord in astonishment. What are you doing here, you scoundrel? Why are you here? And then Lucy came up, and all three of them stared in amazement at the man who was about to kidnap the little ones. He, however, annoyed that the plan had failed, replied angrily. I am here because I was going to take my children. They are mine and have nothing to do with you. You kidnapped them, killed my fiancée, and I want to claim them for myself. I see. Hello, Jack. What a surprise. Where the hell did you come from? And why do you suddenly want kids that aren't yours, you bastard? Their father is in this room. But it isn't you, said Mr. Winston. Damn you, you old fool. The bandit suddenly calmed down and even grinned in the face of his frustrated father-in-law. Thought you wouldn't recognize them, would have adopted them. Then I'd have given them to you, reissued custody, but not for nothing, for money, because I need them. I see. It's clear to me that you're a scoundrel of the highest order. And why a scoundrel? The children could be mine. Why not? And anyway, before you judge me, you should look at yourself. Smart guy, he wanted to foist his pregnant daughter on me. That's the way it goes, enterprising dad. You'd better shut up, you rascal. While this conversation was going on, Thomas and Cassandra tried to calm the children down. Oh, Cassandra, you're covered in blood. He hurt you, the housekeeper finally exclaimed, noticing that Cassandra was bleeding from her broken lip and from her shoulder as well. Still needs to be treated, bandaged. It's nothing. It doesn't even hurt, Cassandra waved it off. It was only then that she noticed that the entire sleeve of her dressing gown was soaked with blood, which was already beginning to drip onto the floor. Thomas and Lucy tried to administer first aid, but the bandit didn't care about that at all. He was interested in another matter. And so it's okay. I didn't steal anyone. I can go in peace. I hope nobody's going to call the police. And there was nothing wrong with the shouting either. I just punched her a couple of times. She attacked me. Well, am I going to go? We're not going anywhere. You'll answer for everything. For the kidnapping, and for those couple of times Mr. Winston sieged him. And you, Cassandra, really need to get your wounds treated. Wait a minute. What's wrong with your arm? Is that a knife wound? Mr. Winston pulled his dressing gown down off his shoulder, examining Cassandra's wound. Oh, it's nothing. It's a scratch, really a deep one. That's why there's probably a lot of blood. Lucy was already flapping around her, wiping away the blood with a towel. And Mr. Winston was suddenly acting very strangely, and even frightened the girl. He came closer to her, pulled his dressing gown off his shoulder, and asked, jabbing his finger at her back, "What's that you've got there?" "Where?" Cassandra replied in amazement, not realizing what other wound had caught his attention. "But there's a spot on my back, closer to my shoulder." Thomas approached as well, examining the girl. "Yeah, I think it's just a birthmark. No wound," he said. "It's unusual though, it looks like a heart." "Well, yes, it's my birthmark and it's always been there." "What is it?" Cassandra didn't understand. "What's special is that my wife had the exact same one, and so did my daughter." "Didn't you notice it, Cassandra? You saw Margaret, didn't you?" "Don't know, I haven't noticed it." "I haven't had a chance to look at her back." Cassandra really didn't understand what was going on. "No, I'm sorry. And this whole thing can't be called an accident. I've never seen spots like that on anyone else. You say you grew up in an orphanage. Have you ever seen your mother?" "I've seen her, but she gave me up when I was only 2. I don't remember her face, not to mention any stains." "And what do you think?" She couldn't believe her ears. "I don't know, Cassandra. I don't know anything. But it's something we need to find out." Mr. Winston was concentrating. "Do you need an ambulance?" "Why would I? I'll just put a band-aid on it, and it'll go away." "My teeth seem to be intact," Cassandra reassured the children. There was hardly any blood coming from her arm. No need for the police either. "Had a badge," the thug added. "And a bonus to you for kidnapping children. Do you realize what article that is?" Mr. Winston was indignant. "I do. That's why I'm asking you not to summon anyone." "What have I gained you? You were the reason I ran away, by the way, because you were demanding a debt from me. So Margaret didn't want to marry me. She said so herself, so I've been suffering with you two all this time. And I wasn't going to do anything bad to the children. I would have brought them back. What do I need those screaming babies for?" "You're the one who's going to figure it out. The babies are fine. Lucy will bandage her up, then calm the babies down somehow. And you, get up, let's go." Mr. Winston turned to Thomas. "Keep an eye on him, lest he run away." That was not Mr. Winston's concern at the moment, however. Indeed, this Jack had done their family a great deal of mischief, and it was necessary to consider what to do with him next. But he didn't want to. He was preoccupied with something else, the birthmark of a rather unusual shape, and the fate of his wife, once many years ago. He hadn't done much searching for her. Firstly, there were no such opportunities then, and secondly, there was no time and special desire too. Everything was clear enough. She ran off with another man, abandoned her daughter. Why did he need such a woman? Even if he had found her, no relationship could be established. And to meet Margaret, to throw some accusation in her face, he didn't care about that at all. Now, for some reason, he wanted to find her. mostly to ask about Cassandra, but he couldn't do it himself, so the next day he went back to the private detective, who would help him track down. Now Mr. Winston asked him to track down the woman who had long ago abandoned him. Strangely enough, this proved easier than one might have expected. The detective soon informed him that Annie lived not so far from him in a neighboring state, and strangely enough, had been working at the church there for quite some time. Mr. Winston, of course, was surprised and decided to go after all, to see the one he had once loved so much, and to ask a question not seemingly related to their past. No one answered the doorbell. He went to the church, where he asked the woman in the local shop how to find Annie. She pointed him to the cleaning lady. If he'd met her on the street, he'd never have recognized her. There was nothing left of her former beauty. Annie had long since looked much older than her years, to a poorly dressed, modest elderly woman in a dark headscarf, naturally without any trace of makeup, and without the slightest attempt to beautify herself. "Hello, Annie," he said sadly, walking up to her. "Winston," Annie exclaimed in surprise, and even staggered slightly, pressing her hand to her heart. "Yes, it's me. Wanted to talk to you. I don't know if you'll want to. I just have a few questions for you." "Yeah, sure," Annie mumbled confusedly, rubbing the edge of her dark blouse. "Come on, let's go outside and sit over there. There are benches." "I have a major question for you, Annie. We don't really have anything to talk about. What's happened is long gone. I want to ask you this. Did you have any other daughters besides Margaret?" "What?" Annie asked in astonishment. "Where do you come from?" "Yes, I did," she replied meekly. "You're right. Of course, nothing connects us anymore, and there can't be anything in common between us. What is there to hide now? I had a little daughter, Cassandra, not yet 2 years old when you and I met. But you remember how I had a crush on you and wanted to marry you more than anything. I thought it would secure my fate. How could I tell you I had a daughter? You would have rejected me right away. Such an eligible suitor. So I took her to an orphanage. I thought it was just for a while. Then, when we get married, I'll confess, I'll take her back sometime. And then, you see how it turned out. Well, not only did you not take Cassandra, you left Margaret behind. I'm sorry, Pasha. It's just the way it turned out. I was a young fool. I met another man, thought he was even richer than you, so I ran after him. And I've already hidden 2 daughters from him." "Well, yes," asked Mr. Winston gloomily. "It was even easier with Margaret. I mean, she stayed with you with her father, and that man knew I was married. He didn't know about the children. And you see, I didn't get any happiness there either. I got bored with my lover and he left me. And I didn't realize then that I had lost my real happiness when I left my daughters. I went looking for something again. That's what I was looking for. Now I go to pray for my sins. I didn't leave my children anywhere else, because you know how unexpected things can happen. I met your first daughter by chance, and you needn't ask me. I'm sorry, but it's no longer your business. And don't ask about Margaret, and don't ask about me. She's gone and gone from our lives." "No, she didn't leave again. There were no more children." She pulled her kerchief from her head and ducked her face into it. Mr. Winston sat for a while, looking at the shuddering thin shoulders, at the gray, stray hair of his former lover. He got up to leave, but sank back on the bench. But not because he had anything to say. He just didn't know what else to say for the last time. He didn't want to leave like this. Annie took the kerchief away from her face, put it on the bench between herself and Mr. Winston, and said, "You're right. It's nobody else's business. I've gone off on my own, left everything behind. Why should I bother other people now? That's what my father told me in confession. Don't. I was young, healthy, beautiful, and they didn't need me. Why should I impose myself on anyone now? Go on, go on. I'm sure they'll be happy with you. And me? Well, I'm fine. I live quietly, peacefully. That's fine. I'm sorry I shouldn't have come, of course. But with that question about the other daughter, no one would have answered it but me. Well, goodbye then. Have a nice day." Annie, without looking at him, muttered some words of farewell, crossed him on the back, rose, tied her kerchief again, and went away. Mr. Winston, on the way home, thought that perhaps Margaret's death should have been told too. She must still be thinking her daughter was alive, praying for her health. Maybe I was right not to tell her. Let her think she's happy. Maybe she should have helped herself. You can see she's poor. It's not just poor, it's practically miserable. How could I help her, though? She wouldn't take money. You can see from her that she has completely different values now. That's how life has taught her. When he got home, he didn't tell Cassandra anything about the meeting, but furtively took a few hairs from her and the twins and then gave them to the lab for DNA testing. The results of the test clearly confirmed Cassandra's close relationship to the children. Mr. Winston had no doubts about that. But after receiving the confirmation, he decided not to hide it from Cassandra and told her everything. I'm surprised I didn't realize it myself when Margaret was alive. You're just like her, and yet you're so close, so friendly. You must have felt some kind of kinship. So Cassandra, you're like a daughter to me now. My grandchildren's own aunt, after all. So stay with me no longer as a nanny, but as my own person. We're all family, no matter how you put it. God, I've never been happier than I am right now, she murmured, covering her face with her hands. I have family. I really loved Michael and David as my own, didn't I? And I did feel something for them, and for Margaret, but I didn't dare believe it. It's like that in our orphanage. They make friends with someone and think they're their sister or brother. Many children invented some kind of kinship for themselves. I didn't do it. I didn't think it was right. And now it turns out that I don't need to invent anything. I had my own sister next to me, and I didn't know it. Well, now you do. So stay, Cassandra. Will you be in Margaret's place for us? Thank you, Mr. Winston. You are an extraordinary man. You and Thomas have also taken me in now, haven't you? You've changed our lives. Oh, come on. That's just the way fate turns. And it has nothing to do with my being ordinary or extraordinary. And Mr. Winston remembered Annie again. Yes, he had accepted and even loved people who had not long ago been strangers to him, but for some reason he had not accepted her. Not because he could not forgive her. He had let it go long ago, but he thought it was better for her to stay in the state she was in. She'd said so herself. But now he hesitated, and he couldn't bear to confess. Mrs. Sandra, I found your mother with Margaret. I wanted to ask her first if she had a daughter before she met me. And he recounted the encounter in detail. Now you're wondering whether you should get on with her or not. Ah, I don't know. I forgot about that situation a long time ago. I let it go. I never thought about looking for my mother. I thought I could find her. But then what? Talking to her seems to be completely uninteresting and about nothing. Besides, she could turn out to be such a person that later you would not know how to get rid of her. We orphanages had such cases. Normal people don't give up their children. And now, I think I know where she is, and I don't care. That's bad, I guess. I had the same thoughts myself. I think I forgave her a long time ago, didn't remember her. Even now, I don't think I have any feelings either. But something bothers me. Although she says that everything is fine, she's happy with her life. But I see what kind of life it is, and I do not know what to do. And most importantly, to understand whether she needs all this. Meeting, communication, she said she doesn't need it. But I can tell she's lonely. Okay, we'll wait. Maybe some answer will come. She's got her own life, we've got ours. I'm more interested in what's going on with you and Thomas. I can see that you two are attracted to each other. Mr. Winston changed the subject. Cassandra, hearing his words, smiled embarrassedly and blushed. Is it noticeable? She asked in surprise. You bet it is. It's not clear what you're trying to hide. Both of you are free adults. If you love each other, why not be together? Time, Cassandra, is running fast. Why waste it on some unnecessary secrets? Besides, you two aren't strangers. You have a home, a job, a future. I was uncomfortable with Thomas in front of you too. I mean, he was sort of with Margaret. She's your daughter. How silly is that? If Margaret were alive, yes, that's an argument. But now, from that day on, Cassandra and Thomas really stopped hiding from others. So when the children were a year old, did they announce that they had decided to marry? Mr. Winston gave his fatherly blessing to their union, and they began to prepare for the wedding. Maybe I should invite my mom to the wedding, Cassandra asked her named father one day. Nothing against that at all. I doubt she'll come, though. You know, maybe you could visit her first. Meet her there and ask. Cassandra drove down. For a long time she looked from the side at the woman who had once given birth to her, hesitating to get any closer. Finally plucking up the courage, she approached. Hello, I'm Cassandra. Annie clutched at her heart, almost fell over on the spot. Her daughter was there in time to pick her up. They chatted for a long time that day, each of them feeling warmer after the separation. On the day of the wedding, Annie was in the place of honor among the guests. Cassandra often came to visit her mother and her grandchildren from then on. Nicholas walked slowly down the street, his head down and looking at his feet. He was in a bad mood. A couple of hours ago, he had taken his dog to the clinic, where the vet had suggested putting him to sleep as the treatment would be quite expensive. No, I don't agree. Do you hear me? Do what you can now. And the money, I'll definitely find the money. The elderly veterinarian looked at his visitor carefully. Are you sure you want it? The dog was hit by a car. It's a serious matter, you know. The spinal column is injured. True, the true extent of the injury is not yet clear. So, I couldn't help but ask whether you're ready to go all the way or not. Tears glistened in Nicholas' eyes. Of course I'm ready. What's that about? Yes, I have no one in my life closer than Dick. What will I do without him? Do whatever you have to do. I don't mind. Just save him. The vet nodded in agreement. He saw in the young man's eyes what he wanted to see. He felt sorry for the dog, young, strong, hit by a car. It would be possible to fight, of course. The main thing was that the owner would not let him down, and he seemed to be serious. All right, I'll try. You come back tomorrow. I'll keep the dog for now. He looks at you well, devotedly. The vet sighed sadly and summed up. Okay, sure, I'll be sure to come. You just help Dick. I took him in as a puppy, Nicholas pleaded, hope in his eyes. But as soon as he left the vet's office, a new sense of hopelessness came over him. Where will I get the money? This question tormented his mind, depriving him of peace of mind and balance. Of course, Nicholas could ask a little from colleagues at work, but they still could not give the necessary amount of money, and there was a lot of money needed. At the same time, the guy did not even allow the idea that Dick would have to be put to sleep. He loved this dog with all his heart and was ready to sacrifice everything he could to save him. In front of Nicholas' eyes, there was still a huge SUV, which flew past at breakneck speed. This is despite the fact that the guy, together with his friend, was crossing the road on the pedestrian crossing. And what if a person or, God forbid, a child had fallen under the car? Unfortunately, Dick noticed the danger too late, tried to jump back to save himself, but it was only partially successful because the bumper of the SUV still caught him, hitting him in the side. Gently picking up the bloody dog in his arms, Nicholas hurried to the legendary vet. Mr. William could do real miracles, always fighting for the life of injured pets to the end. While his colleagues refused to help hopelessly ill animals, he easily took on the most difficult cases and often won, returning the pet to normal life. From a state of agonizing contemplation on the subject, where can I get the money? Nicholas felt a nudge on his shoulder. The guy reluctantly turned his head and saw a young man in his 30s in a business suit and fashionable Swede shoes. The stranger radiated success and wealth. Nicholas looked questioningly at the rich man. He hesitated for a moment and said, "Listen, lad, what's your name? Do you want to make some money by any chance?" "Sure I do. What are you talking about?" Nicholas visibly perked up. The stranger grinned contentedly. "Now that's talk. Then listen to what you need to do. I'll give you a bouquet ready, and you take it to the cemetery and put it on a grave." "Whose grave?" Nicholas asked immediately. The stranger frowned and pressed his lips together with a displeased look. Nicholas immediately realized that the conversation was not very pleasant for him. "My dead wife's. I have a business meeting to rush to. Today is just a week since the funeral. Well, can you or should I ask someone else?" "Of course I can. It's not a hard thing to do," Nicholas answered immediately, excited by the opportunity to earn some money. The rich man smiled contentedly. "Well then, let's go to the car. I'll hand you the bouquet and the payment. Only you this, I warn you straight away. I don't advise you to cheat. I'll find out anyway. And it's a small world, you know. Come on, I understand everything. I'll deliver the bouquet in the best way," said Nicholas eagerly. Meanwhile, the rich man led him to his car and handed him the flowers. "You put the vase in. There's a special place there. The monument hasn't been erected yet. The time is past too short. Now, you will place the bouquet so that the ribbon tie faces east. That's it." Nicholas nodded in agreement. Understood, of course. What's not to understand when everything is clear? Alrighty then. So where's the money? Don't be in a hurry. The cemetery first, then everything else. Nicholas nodded again. He was glad there was money. Of course it would all go to Dick's treatment. How could it not? He was a friend, a brother practically, if I may say so, and therefore he must do all he could to save him. Taking the bouquet, Nicholas turned back and headed towards the bus stop. The way to the cemetery was not a long way, and such a distance could not be covered quickly on foot. The flowers would wither before you reached the cemetery. And this is not good. After all, one should have respect for the deceased. There were not many people at the bus stop, and Nicholas was visibly relaxed. It meant that he would not have to crowd in the aisle and ride in the stuffy cabin. Seeing a poorly dressed guy with an expensive bouquet of flowers, the woman controller ironically remarked, "You must be loaded. What a gorgeous bouquet you have. It must be expensive." Nicholas suddenly felt embarrassed. Can't the inspector see that the bouquet has an even number of flowers? Turning back to the window, the guy decided to leave the question unanswered. But the woman was clearly not satisfied with it. "So how much does this beauty cost? And where does the money for such luxury come from? Didn't you beg for alms near the church?" Nicholas's cheeks instantly flushed, especially after all the passengers on the bus turned their eyes on him. "They're cemetery flowers, and I didn't buy them," the boy replied in a shaky voice. The controller grinned crookedly. It seemed that it was simply impossible to throw her off balance. "The cemetery, you say? All the more, why should such beauty be wasted? It won't help anyway. You could have bought artificial ones, that's all." Nicholas only shook his head. He caught himself thinking that it would be better if he walked. Looking out the window, the guy watched the passers-by, who were hurrying to go about their business, and involuntarily envied their lives. They have homes, normal families. Not like him, no one around. And what could he do when he grew up in a poor family, where his stepfather drank uncontrollably, and his mother worked 3 jobs to somehow make ends meet? When his mother was gone, his stepfather completely lost touch with reality and practically stopped caring about his stepson. Eventually it ended in a fire and the loss of the house. Nicholas ended up on the streets. He went to an orphanage a couple of times, but escaped from there after a week at most. Of course, Nicholas knew what he was doing was wrong, but he couldn't help himself. Street life dragged on, making its own adjustments in the existence of a young guy. Finally, the stop ahead appeared, and Nicholas exhaled with relief. To his great surprise, the bouquet handed by the rich man was quite heavy, although according to Nicholas himself, it should have been much lighter. However, he didn't want to look into the matter in detail, and why should he mind his own business? His role is simple, to deliver the bouquet, and the job is done. Why make something up? Nicholas had been to the city cemetery many times before. He saw off his mother and even his stepfather, to whom he had long forgiven former offenses. Sighing sadly, the boy approached the gate, which creaked nastily with long unlubricated hinges. The air was filled with the fragrance of fresh flowers in the flower beds planted by concerned citizens of the city. Turning to the alley he needed, Nicholas saw endless rows of graves strewn with flowers and wreaths laid by relatives of the deceased. As usual, the cemetery was silent, and even if it was broken by the singing of rare birds, it only added to the atmosphere of mystery and universal peace. Nicholas walked down an alley covered with fallen leaves, even though autumn had just begun. The trees were in a hurry to get rid of their summer finery as soon as possible. He walked slowly, occasionally stopping at graves and reading the names and dates engraved on the plaques. He needed Amanda's grave. He remembered the name at once, but he still took the note with a reminder from the rich man, so that the customer would not doubt that the assignment was being fulfilled. Following the instructions, Nicholas passed several old crypts, surrounded by lush vegetation that made them seem like relics of a bygone past. The walls were covered with memorial inscriptions that had turned a dark green color from time and precipitation. Shaking his head, Nicholas walked on to where the new burials were visible. The caretaker's gate was located a little further away, but the vagabond deliberately walked round the side of it so as not to meet him at the entrance. He knew that the old keeper had retired not so long ago, and the new one was arrogant and had a very negative attitude towards the homeless. In the old days, Nicholas had often come to the cemetery in search of food that had been left on the graves. The old caretaker treated vagrants with understanding and never took offense. What's wrong if a hungry person takes a candy or a biscuit? It happens that even a bun will fall to you. Eat, darlings, and remember the dead with a kind word, he said. But the new watchman turned out to be quite different, quarrelsome and angry, saw only bad things in homeless people. Nicholas had already got acquainted with him, and therefore did not want to meet again. Walking along the path further, the guy finally saw a small cross with a photo of the deceased, mourning wreaths and wax candles, which created an atmosphere of grief and sadness. Nicholas approached the cross almost closely to finally eliminate the possibility of a mistake. Amanda Harrison. Nicholas read silently, moving his lips. At that, the boy was overcome with mixed feelings. On the one hand, he felt sorry for the sweet woman with the sad brown eyes, and on the other hand, he couldn't understand why the rich man couldn't find time to bring flowers to the cemetery himself. Is he really that busy? With his abilities and the availability of a car, it could have been done quickly, and the late Amanda would surely have been more pleased, even if in the afterlife. But that didn't change the point. Amidst the ringing silence of the cemetery, he bowed his head in silence, remembering his departed relatives. The bouquet in Nicholas's hands trembled as he leaned over the vase to place the flowers in it. Suddenly something glinted in the midday sunlight, and the strange glint came from the bouquet, not from anything else. He flinched and blinked involuntarily. Jesus, is that a piece of jewelry or glass? Still not knowing the answer to his question, Nicholas gingerly ran his fingers deep into the bouquet and froze in amazement. The thing was that lurking between the flower stems and leaves was a miniature hidden camera with a small lens like a door peephole. Wow. So much for going to the cemetery. I thought I was just taking flowers to the cemetery. But here's a whole spy story, Nicholas whispered in amazement as he looked at the thing. At that moment, he suddenly felt uncomfortable. Not only had this rich man made him take flowers to his wife's grave, but he had secretly equipped the bouquet with a hidden camera. In Nicholas's opinion, this was too much. And why? I only agreed to this adventure. Although why ask? Obviously for the money, Nicholas said to himself. He was suddenly dizzy at the thought of who was behind this insidious development. He quickly looked round the rest of the flowers for possible findings, but found nothing. The camera was a one-of-a-kind and was clearly intended for covert surveillance of his late wife's grave. At that moment, Nicholas suddenly felt a distinct sense of uneasiness, which was mixed with the scent of flowers, fresh earth, and the grave mound. Of course, the guy was well aware that by accidentally finding the camera, he put at risk the whole scheme of the businessman. No matter how it was, but he got the money for his work, and the work itself was valued quite highly, which in turn implied that Nicholas, in case of anything, would be silent. Suddenly there was a rustle behind him. The tramp turned round and saw a boy of about 7 or 8 years old behind him. The boy's eyes were filled with tears, and his lips were trembling as if in a fever. The boy's mood was reflected in his blue, slightly sad eyes, as if he had not experienced true childlike joy in his life for a long time. Dressed in old, worn-out clothes, he still created a special aura of warmth and kindness around him. It was like a flower emerging from a crack in the ground. "Oh, what are you doing sneaking up on me from behind like that? You're stuttering," Nicholas said, trying to lighten the mood. The boy visibly relaxed and, wiping away a tear, said, "I'm sorry, Uncle. I didn't know it would come out like that. I just didn't realize there was someone at the grave." "That's all right, mate. It's just a matter of course. What did you want?" The boy hesitated, as if considering whether or not to tell this strange man the truth. Finally, feeling a wave of kindness and warmth coming from Nicholas, he made up his mind. "My name is Kevin. I'm from the orphanage. And Aunt Amanda, well, she's been helping me and my grandfather. So I came to check on her. The tramp raised an eyebrow in surprise. And my name is Uncle Nicholas. Well, you can just call me Nicholas. That's interesting. Why are you being raised in an orphanage when you have a grandfather? Kevin sighed sadly. That's what the committee decided. You know, the one the Social Security aunts put together. My grandfather was really sick. There was no hope for him. They were afraid he might die. So they took me to an orphanage. Granddad wrote complaints, asking for help. And then I met Aunt Amanda. She was the only one who helped. I think she's a really nice woman, Nicholas remarked, though he'd never met her. The quiet boy had always loved children and tried to help them whenever he could, whether it was to make a toy out of wood or to build a slingshot. At that moment, Nicholas involuntarily remembered about the hidden camera and for whom it was intended. Did the rich man really want to videotape this little boy? But why? What would be the point? After thinking for a moment, Nicholas remarked, "Listen, mate, let's get out of here. It'll be evening soon, and it's pretty dangerous to stay in the cemetery at night. I'll take you to the orphanage. Don't tell them you know me, or they won't let you out for a long time." Kevin smiled and nodded in agreement. Then he took a candy bar out of his pocket and placed it on the grave mound next to the cross. Nicholas's heart snapped at the sight of it. How kind this little fellow is. A woman he doesn't know very well, and yet he still cares. Leaving the cemetery, Nicholas didn't go to the bus stop because it wasn't too far to walk home. On the way, Kevin told him about how kind Aunt Amanda had paid for his grandfather's medical treatment and also wanted to set up guardianship for him herself. And what became of Amanda? Nicholas inquired cautiously. Kevin sighed sadly. Granddad said she was killed in an accident. There was nothing left of the car at all. Grandpa cried he was worried sick. Nicholas bit his lip painfully. Only now he understood why such a young and blooming woman had left her life so early. It turned out that the car accident had been to blame. And why do only the best ones leave? Walking the boy back to the orphanage, Nicholas shook Kevin's hand and told him where he could be found in case of emergency. There were few things in life that knowledge could come in handy. At the same time, on the other side of the city, businessman Michael sat in his office and waited for the camera installed in the cemetery to start video surveillance. He had no idea that Nicholas had accidentally switched off the camera when he took it out of the bouquet, hence expecting a recording was pointless. Did that bum do something wrong? What if he found the camera? What a rascal, puzzled Michael, never finding an answer to his question. The businessman left the office and headed for the kitchen, where his new lover Betty was waiting for him. "You're taking a long time tonight, honey. Are you having dinner?" Michael looked at his mistress with a smile. "I will, of course I will. I've been sitting in my office for a long time, but I can't do without it. The camera thing didn't work out, I guess. Amanda outplayed me again." "And let me ask you, what did she beat you at?" Betty asked in surprise. Michael wrinkled his nose like a toothache. "Well, how can I put it? When she was gone, I thought all the assets would go to me. That's not how it turned out. According to the notary, Amanda's inheritance will go to a man whose name is kept top secret. Who could that be? Who's the rich, lucky man?" Betty frowned. "Well, about the inheritance. Let's say I get it. What does it have to do with hidden cameras? Why did you install one on the grave?" "Well, you're like a little girl, Betty. It's a simple thing. You know about bait trapping, don't you?" "Well, the bait in my case would be Amanda's grave itself," Michael replied. Betty shook her head again incomprehensibly. To her mind, which was not very clever, such tasks seemed extremely difficult, and so her lover's scheme remained a mystery to her. "Well, it's simple. Imagine, for example, you received an inheritance. Wouldn't you come to the cemetery to thank the deceased?" "I would. I certainly would. So I'm waiting for the heir to show up at the cemetery. That's what I need the camera for, you know. To know who's been visiting Amanda's grave these days. I mean, she's an orphan. She's got no relatives. There were like 20 people at the funeral. That means whoever comes will be the heir," Michael explained in an orderly manner. Betty smiled. I always knew you were smart. I can't believe you'd think of something like that. That's clever. Clever. But the camera doesn't work for some reason. And why didn't I take the flowers myself? I didn't want to make a fuss about the air. Amanda wasn't stupid either, so it's all covered up. All I know is it's a lot of money. I wanted to withdraw the money, but the banker told me I couldn't, because according to the will, you can't. Who could she leave such money to? Michael said irritably. But we still have a company. Wouldn't that be enough? Betty objected. What's a company without a cash infusion? A firm is worth nothing. Shortly before she died, Amanda took all the funds out of circulation. In fact, the firm would be bankrupt not today or tomorrow. The businessman's arguments were more than valid, for he knew what he was talking about. Betty understood that as well as anyone. They had met about a year ago at a fashion show at the model house. The tall, sultry beauty had immediately caught Michael's eye, who had always had a thing for women. He never loved Amanda and connected his life with her only because of his thirst for profit. Amanda's business was built on a network of repair shops that employed people from the orphanage where she spent her childhood. Amanda always paid her wages on time, and its size could not but please yesterday's graduates. Michael, as long as he could remember, had never been distinguished for his success because he was lazy and spoilt by his rich parents, who later went bankrupt and had to send his son on his own on the waves of business. Having failed a couple of promising deals, the former major realized that he would not make a successful entrepreneur. So, it was necessary to urgently look for another way to get rich and return his family's former influence. That's when Michael met Amanda, who seemed to him the embodiment of success and femininity at the same time. But only sincere feelings for the chosen one yesterday's major has never been. Not only that, Michael's mother, Mrs. Vivian, considered Amanda an upstart who got into the hands of untold riches. She preferred to keep quiet about the fact that Amanda had achieved everything she had on her own. Mrs. Vivian set up her son so that he would one day become the heir to Amanda's business empire. The lessons of his mother were not in vain, and from the first day of their acquaintance, Michael only thought about money. Amanda's death was definitely to his advantage. In his mind, he had already divided her financial savings and imagined himself a rich man. But the unexpected bequest confused the cards. And who did she leave it to? Who's the lucky guy? Realizing that only the deceased wife knows the answer to this question, Michael decided to act more decisively and first intended to talk to the very vagrant, who, because of his laziness, instructed to take the bouquet to the cemetery. Naturally, Nicholas knew nothing of this. The next morning he went to the veterinarian who had treated Dick. As it turned out, Mr. William had performed the operation at his own risk, the results of which were still very uncertain. But it hasn't got any worse, has it? Nicholas asked anxiously. The doctor interlocked his fingers and looked at his guest. No. It hasn't got worse, of course. Really, it's gotten better, too. Dick is rather in a borderline condition now, you know. But he's young, he's got to make it. And then God willing, continued the doctor. A glimmer of hope appeared in Nicholas's eyes. Here, take the money here. I'll bring more. You just don't stop the treatment. All right? The vet smiled. Don't worry, lad, I'll do the right thing. I didn't choose this profession for nothing, even though my parents were against it. So I don't treat my pets for money. He's a good dog, I believe he'll pull through. Tell me, can I at least have one look at him? I'll be quick. Really, Nicholas begged. The doctor sighed sympathetically and then led the lad into a room that served as a ward for operated pets. Dick lay on a couch standing in a corner of the room. It was covered with soft bedding for comfort. Biting his lip painfully, Nicholas saw his pet's chest heaving. When he heard soft footsteps, Dick opened his eyes and almost immediately met his master's gaze. He seemed to want to say thank you. In the neighborhood of the dog's neck, he could see a bandage securely fastened, which once again reminded him of the pain he had endured. Nicholas took a few more steps, and Dick's tail moved slightly. Even now, on the brink of life and death, the faithful friend was expressing his devotion and love to his master. Nicholas turned round and looked pleadingly at the vet. He nodded, giving permission to stroke the dog's head. Tears glistened in Nicholas's eyes. Carefully touching the dog's head, he gently stroked it and said, "Be patient, my friend. You'll get through this. I know you will." The dog listened attentively, as if he understood every word. Dick blinked twice and then closed his eyes tiredly. To Nicholas, this was the signal that the visit was over. Leaving the room, the lad thanked the doctor warmly for his help and promised to come back tomorrow. The sight of his helpless comrade stirred up the most contradictory feelings in his soul. He walked along the street, not noticing the passers-by who were avoiding him. No, it was not Nicholas's clothes. It didn't seem to stand out too much against the background of ordinary people. Most likely, people subconsciously felt the aura of heartache and despair that surrounded the young tramp. Nicholas still couldn't think why the driver of the SUV had increased the throttle when he saw them at the pedestrian crossing. Did the rascal deliberately want to run Dick down? But why? It's out of the realm of possibility. Immersed in sad thoughts, Nicholas walked down the street, wondering where to get money. Lately, when the part-time work became less and less, it was extremely difficult to find something good. Suddenly, someone called his name softly. The boy turned around and saw a confused Kevin, who, as was his custom, had already climbed out of the orphanage through the window. "Oh, there you are. And I've been looking for you. I need your help. Grandpa's sick and the roof is leaking. I can't live with him. He's always putting basins in front of leaks. Today it's so thick. It's going to rain. It's not much work. I just don't have the strength. The slate is torn off in one place, so the water is running down. Can you help?" the boy asked maturely. Nicholas looked round, then said, "Kevin, what are you talking about? Come on, of course. Why not help a good man?" "Thank you. You're a true friend." Taking the boy by the hand, Nicholas walked in the direction indicated. The young tramp was unaware that at this very moment he was being watched very closely. After the incident with the bouquet in the cemetery, Michael Harrison decided to take a closer look at the identity of this homeless man. What if he knows a lot more than he's saying? Michael's hunch did not fail him, and this time the vagrant was indeed not as simple as he seemed. And who's that little boy tailing him? After following the couple almost all the way home, Michael made a note of the address so that he could make inquiries about it in the future. Kevin's grandfather, Mr. Oliver, lived in the suburbs on an inconspicuous street where fruit trees grew in large numbers. And so my grandfather used to plant. He loves his garden. Sometimes he'll set up a chair, sit down and listen to the trees talking. "You know, when the wind sways the branches," Kevin said proudly. Nicholas smiled and gave a respectful thumbs up. He noticed Mr. Oliver's house immediately, even though he had never been to the area. It was a small structure that had once seemed cozy and welcoming, but was now in need of a quick renovation. The front of the house was covered in ivy and in some places had deep cracks. The wooden windows, painted in light colors, had long ago burned out in the sun. The shutters, leaning to one side, were literally hanging on by a thread. They could have been torn off in a strong gust of wind. The roof, green in places from the moss growing on it, did not inspire confidence and looked more like a giant mushroom than a roof. But it was the garden that Nicholas found most pleasing to the eye. Apple, pear, and plum trees, surrounded by a wooden fence, stretched their branches toward the sun, pleasing the inhabitants of the neighboring houses with their bounty. Nicholas picked an apple from the branch, rubbed it on his t-shirt, and immediately tasted it. It was juicy and sweet, which caused a happy smile on his face. Kevin opened the gate, which creaked softly, and entered the yard. Nicholas immediately followed suit, but no sooner had he taken a couple of steps than the door of the house opened, and a thin, elderly man appeared on the doorstep. "Wow, Kevin's here, my grandson," exclaimed the old man, and the little boy rushed to hug him. Nicholas tactfully stepped aside so as not to embarrass the relatives. It didn't take long, though, because after a couple of minutes, Kevin introduced the guest to his grandfather. Mr. Oliver was an old-school man and had spent about 40 years of his life working at the ambulance station. Setting the table, the elderly man poured tea from an old samovar into cups before adding a tray of sweet pastries. A neighbor brought some, "Annie never forgets me," Grandpa explained, intercepting his guest's surprised look. Nicholas nodded and took a bite of the sweet bun. A blissful smile immediately appeared on the tramp's face. "Wow, this is delicious. Haven't had one of these in ages." "What, Nicholas, are you tired? You're young, you need your strength. I'm the one who's already written off, but I'm still hanging in there. How else can you do it? With a little man in your arms. I'll play Kevin's wedding, and then I can retire. But until then I can't," said the grandfather. "Well, what kind of wedding can there be if I haven't got a bride yet? As soon as I find one, we'll get married," Kevin said seriously, which made his grandfather and Nicholas laugh. At the table, Mr. Oliver became emotional, and he was drawn to revelations. "I started out as an orderly. When the superintendent recognized my aptitude, he sent me to study. I initially resisted, even ran away from lectures. The teachers almost expelled me. But then I developed a respect for medical science." Nicholas listened silently, not interrupting and paying attention to every word. But Kevin could not boast of such diligence, which made him ask his grandfather various tricky questions. "Granddad, what's the most memorable incident you remember from your time in the ambulance?" Mr. Oliver thought for a moment. His gray eyebrows drew together in a single line. A thick network of wrinkles lay across his forehead, and his gaze became detached, as if he were now in another reality. "A case, you say?" "There's a case, and a big one at that. It was a long time ago, about 20 years ago, probably. It was a snowy winter. My little house was covered with snow." "What? Right up to the roof? How did you get out of the house? Through the chimney?" Kevin questioned. But the man just waved it off. "Well, that's just for the beauty of the word. Maybe not up to the roof. It doesn't matter. That's not the point. In the middle of a snowstorm, we received a call at the ambulance station. There's a woman in labor in the village. She was in labor, but they called a midwife as usual. The labor was complicated. What a joke, twins. It was a high-profile case. It went viral in the whole region. There was even an article in the newspaper. I first kept it, and then I burnt it." "Why not, Grandpa? It's a memory after all. I could have shown the clipping to the boys in the orphanage. I'd be respected, you know." Kevin couldn't help himself. Tears glistened in Mr. Oliver's eyes. His face suddenly wrinkled and looked like a baked apple. His lips trembled treacherously, but the former paramedic still did not cry, and, pulling himself together, suppressed the tearful attack. "I was ashamed of myself, grandson. Very ashamed." "Your Miles, while he was making his way to his mummy, an hour and a half had passed, thanks to a good tractor driver who cleared the road and helped us out of the skid. And then, as soon as I saw the woman in labor, I knew at once that there was no escape. But the snow was blowing, the tractor broke down, and we had to get to the right house on foot. You know, the machinery in the village is old. It barely works." "Wow, what an adventure. Grandpa, you're a real hero." "Wait, hero. Don't be in a hurry. The childbirth was not very healthy. It was rumored that 6 months before the birth her fiancé drowned in the river. He wanted to take a shortcut, but he drove his lorry across the old bridge, and it was closed. It was in disrepair. So, in other words, the poor guy went underwater. I immediately realized that we would have to suffer a lot, both the woman in labor and us, the doctors. And the snow keeps blowing. Soon the cleared area was covered with snow again, and I decided to give birth at home. There was a case in the hospital, so this woman went straight to the cesarean. But what about here? So I had to find a way out. I did everything I asked. And she was a good girl. She had a lot of character. She gave birth to a girl first, a thin girl like a doll, and the boy was a little bigger, a real hero. He flatly refused to show himself to the light of God. His mum was exhausted, and then she had some kind of reaction. Whether from painful shock or something else, she started choking on her heart. Her larynx started to swell. I knew immediately that the situation was extremely dangerous. But what could I do? I'm not a surgeon. At this point, Mr. Oliver paused, making it clear that it was very painful for him to talk about such things. Nicholas listened to him as if spellbound. All the possible variants of the further events of the story flashed through his mind. but what followed shocked him. "I'm sorry, grandson. Let me tell Nicholas everything separately first, so that it won't be so graphic," Mr. Oliver asked gently, causing the boy's face to show a childish resentment. He did not, however, contradict his beloved grandfather. He left the room, closing the door tightly behind him. Mr. Oliver looked into Nicholas's eyes, as if seeking support in them. "I'm sorry I did that, I just couldn't do it any other way." Anyway, she started choking. "We can't get out of the snow. The situation is desperate, and she could die, and the unborn baby." "Thank you, I didn't get hysterical. I even started to calm the poor thing down. When I tried to relieve the laryngeal edema, I had my doubts. It seemed to work. The drug helped. The poor thing was able to breathe more or less normally, and literally pushed the boy out with all her might. He's healthy, I'll tell you. He's a sight to behold." Nicholas looked at the older doctor with respect. "So what are you ashamed of, Mr. Oliver? You did the right thing." After his guest's words, tears streamed down his cheeks from his grandfather's eyes. They around his salary and beard made it glisten in the light of the burning chandelier overhead. Nicholas gently touched Mr. Oliver's wrist and tried to reassure him. But there was only one thing that could help in a case like this: time and silence. At last, Mr. Oliver calmed down and came to the main point. The road was only cleared by evening, but the woman in labor didn't wait for it. The poor woman left, leaving the babies orphaned. The commission had to deal with it for a long time. They made me guilty. They said it was me who provoked a heart attack with that very drug for suffocation. They suspended me from work and started an investigation. However, the case was closed afterwards. But my regret is not about that, Nicholas, but about the fact that at least one child did not take a family. I started the paperwork twice, but Gwen and I couldn't afford 2 children, and we didn't dare to separate the little brother and sister. How could we do that? And I was getting on in years. Nicholas nodded sympathetically and added in a low voice, "It happens." Mr. Oliver looked apprehensively at the door behind where Kevin was and gave his guest a meaningful look, hesitated a moment, then said, "You may not believe me, but that same rescued twin girl found me the other day. Can you believe it? Just like that. She came in and told it like it is. I didn't tell Kevin, he doesn't need to know. Only the girl's name was Amanda. Her mom died, they say. But she was such a good, kind person. She paid for my treatment, and I refused. It was shameful, being a grown man after all, but she insisted." Nicholas's breath caught in surprise. "So she found you on her own, just like that. How did she know about all this?" Mr. Oliver sighed sadly. "I think she hired someone. Private investigators can do wonders these days. Someone at the orphanage must have secretly told her about her birth, so she decided to find me. The only bad thing is, Amanda never found her brother. They were separated when she was 2, I think. It's a sad story." Nicholas sat staring at the former paramedic as if mesmerized. Do such events really happen in life? It's just unthinkable. It's hard. And how did he end up in the center of it? Nicholas was brought out of his agonizing musings by the sound of the door opening, and a second later Kevin's disheveled head appeared in the gap. "Grandpa, have you all talked yet? I'm bored already." Mr. Oliver winked at Nicholas and said peacefully, come in, grandson. It's all right, we had a chat." Kevin squinted at his grandfather. "The story ended well, didn't it, Granddad?" "It did, Kevin, it did." "How?" "Good always triumphs over evil." After sitting at the table for a while, Nicholas thanked his grandfather for his hospitality and went to fix the roof. Of course, he didn't have much experience in such matters. And how could he have any when he had never lived in his own house? More and more on the streets, in cellars and abandoned buildings. Despite his lack of skills, Nicholas fixed the roof. Not as well as a specialist would have done it, but it was pretty good. The main thing is that there will be no more leaks. And outward beauty didn't matter to Oliver's grandfather. Sitting upstairs and tapping the hammer, Nicholas had no idea that at that very moment Michael was watching him closely. The businessman had already guessed that the boy and the vagrant clearly had something to do with each other. Determined to find out, Michael called the head of security, whom he had once saved from prosecution for theft. Terrence did not have a legal education, but in solving slippery issues, he was no equal. It was to him Michael entrusted the elimination of his wife. But blind chance had a way of working things out. While Terrence was developing an attempt on Amanda, she was in a car accident, which greatly facilitated the conspirators' task. The only thing Michael miscalculated was that he didn't have time to make a will. The deceased businesswoman had left everyone a fool. But that's who she left everything to. Who comes to visit her grave? Michael tried to involve the cemetery caretaker, but he turned out to be a man of non-committal and unreliable. The bouquet and the hidden camera had not yielded much result either. The mysterious heir still remained in the shadows. In desperation, Michael promised huge sums of money to Amanda's personal notary, but all was in vain. The old man could keep secrets like no one else, and no bribes or intimidation could change his mind. Having finished with the roof, Nicholas washed himself under the old wash basin and even wiped himself with a terry towel. "Thank you, Nicholas, for helping me out. I'm not going to be able to climb up to the roof. As soon as I get on the ladder, I get dizzy and dizzy," said Mr. Oliver, embarrassed. "Come on, it's not that hard for me." And Kevin's grandson asked for it. "He's such a good little boy," Nicholas said, smiling. "He is what he is. But he likes to be naughty, and he runs away from the orphanage too often. How many times I've asked the director to help me get my grandson back, but he's just like the wall. He says I'm old. I might die and the boy will see me. And that's how we live. Well, maybe we'll be lucky. Grandpa, don't listen to the director. He likes big money, but we won't give him a penny." Aunt Amanda promised to help, but she didn't have time. "Maybe someone else will help us out," Kevin intervened in the conversation. Nicholas exchanged a meaningful glance with Mr. Oliver and said goodbye to the kind host. The boy was still under the impression caused by the elderly paramedic's story and thought only of the late Amanda. How cruel life can be after all. She died in an accident before she could find her family. Nicholas shook his head, said goodbye to his grandfather Oliver, and walked towards the city with Kevin. The boy had to be returned to the orphanage. Frankly speaking, Kevin had been lucky lately, and the carers had accepted the fact that he was visiting his grandfather. Of course, at any moment they could get a reprimand for negligence, but they preferred not to notice the boy's absences, especially as many of them knew Mr. Oliver by sight and respected him for his past services. All the way back, Nicholas felt uncomfortable. An unpleasant feeling in the back of his mind did not let him relax, forcing him to think over and over again about the story of the former paramedic. "If anything, I live in the janitor's den. Well, there, behind the grocery store, you'll find it." I think Nicholas waved goodbye. "I'll be sure to drop in, Uncle Nicholas. Why should I stay in this orphanage? We'll go to Grandpa's, pick apples. I want to start a business. I'll sell my grandfather's apples. I'll stand by the roadside and make money," said the boy excitedly. "Well, go on, businessman. We'll sort it out later," Nicholas smiled. The boy saw the boy off with a look, making sure that he went into the courtyard of the orphanage, then went on. At the same time, in Michael's office, there was a very detailed conversation between him and the head of security, Terrence. "What are we going to do? Who's the heir? Who did my mad wife specify in her will?" The businessman was angry. Terrence frowned, his massive eyebrows hanging over his face like a visor. "I don't know, Michael. It's a vicious circle." "A vicious circle, you say? Total hopelessness? It's all about using your head, Terrence. I didn't sit around this afternoon. I found out who that kid and his granddad were, and the tramp who met him. And you know what I found out. My late wife Amanda paid for his treatment shortly before she died. Why would she do that? You don't know. Well, I'll tell you, there's definitely a connection. A bond," Michael shouted. Terrence looked guiltily at his boss. "But that doesn't mean anything, Michael. Your wife has helped a lot of people. Here is my son from my first marriage gave money for the operation." Charity actively engaged. The businessman in fury slammed his palm on the table. "But how many times do I have to tell you, Terrence? Your son's operation was paid for by the company. And Amanda was just stupid and died a ridiculous death. What was she doing in such a hurry to hit a tree? And the car burned to the ground. Terrence nodded in agreement, deciding not to test his boss's patience, and then cautiously remarked, "Michael, maybe we should resort to unconventional methods." The young widower looked at his subordinate with irony. "How is that, I wonder? Can you be more specific?" Terrence gathered courage and voiced his proposal. "What if we go to a fortune teller? You know, someone who can tell us the truth. She can tell us the heir to the throne. There's someone here, Melanie. She's tried and tested. She's very accurate, but she's expensive." Michael's first reaction was laughter, turning to laughter, to use a fortune teller in such a delicate matter. But then, when the businessman got into the essence of the proposal of the head of security, he realized that there was something interesting in it. "Well, we can try it. We'll take our chances afterwards. They can tell fortunes there, can't they? A house, a long journey, the King of Hearts." Michael was skeptical. "No, she's a true seer. Rumor has it that she came from the capital. She's organized a tour, rented a room in a hotel, and receives clients. They say it's a busy time," Terrence said eagerly. Michael waved his hand. "All right, organize a meeting tomorrow with this. What's her name? Melanie? I'll see what she has in store for me. And keep an eye on that tramp. If the fortune teller doesn't work out, we'll take him on. Let him tell us if he had nothing to do with the camera malfunction." Terrence exhaled a sigh of relief and left the boss's office. Michael sat for a while longer, then switched off the light and went home, where Betty was waiting for him. However, she would soon become not his mistress, but his wife. And who thought up this morning? He'd never loved Amanda, so why all the sentimentality? But no, in public he had to pretend mourning on his face and sometimes even cry, putting a handkerchief to his face. God, it's disgusting and disgusting. Betty met him in the living room with a smile on her face. "Hello, how was work?" Michael threw his jacket off his shoulders and grumbled unhappily. "How could I have worked out? There's nothing but trouble all round. The firm is bankrupt. I never found the heir. That tramp screwed up big time. For Christ's sake. Amanda the bastard. She's been bad for me in the afterlife. She's been looking after some granddad, some boy who's no one's property. Maybe he is the heir. But the grandfather or the boy? Your neighbor's brains are all messed up from the orphanage. Opens shelters for homeless animals, pays for the treatment of strays. She's silly, I'll say," said Betty, which made her lover very interested. "Why, that's a thought. Could the heir really be this kid? Amanda might well have thought of such a thing." Betty smiled enigmatically and approached Michael almost closely. "And I have a surprise for you. Soon, in about 8 months, there will be 3 of us." Michael looked at her incomprehensibly. "What do you mean 3? Is this some kind of joke? What are you talking about?" Betty pouted resentfully and took a couple of steps back. "What do you mean, Michael? I'm pregnant, okay? I mean, we're having a baby. Honestly, that's not the reaction I was expecting from you. Not at all. It's like you're swearing to me that you love me." Michael lowered his eyes in embarrassment. The news Betty had told him had shocked him into believing in a miracle. It had never worked with Amanda, and now they knew each other for nothing. But Michael didn't want to show his confusion, and that wasn't the main thing. The most important thing now is to find the heir and deal with him finally. And then, when everything is solved, you can think about a cozy nest in a house by the sea. "I'm sorry, love, it's just work. I snapped out of it and said the wrong thing," Michael said, trying to hug her. But Betty had already worked herself up into a tizzy and didn't want to give in without a fight. She liked to make a scene, and she was good at it, especially when there was something to be gained. Betty had long thought about a new car, but to get money from Stingy Michael to buy it, had to go to extreme measures. But the businessman himself at this point thought not about the birth of the child, and a visit to this strange fortune teller Melanie. Michael worked out in his mind the questions he intended to ask the fortune teller in order to find out the name of the heir. Since Terrence had already arranged a meeting for tomorrow, the businessman could only wait. In the morning, in anticipation of an important conversation, Michael flatly refused breakfast and put on his best suit. Despite the fact that the fortune teller took on the opposite side of the city, the businessman arrived half an hour before the previously agreed time. As it turned out, the fortune teller was already in place and sat at her desk. Her fiery red hair fell over her shoulders, partially covering her forehead, artfully arranged in curls. Melanie's face was covered by a dark veil, which only added a touch of mystery to her image. The room smelled of some incense, which made Michael cough and immediately covered his palm with his hand. "Good afternoon. What a smell you have here. Is that basil? I'm allergic to basil. Can we get some air in here? I'm actually an appointment." Michael Harrison, the businessman, began. Melanie gave him an assessing look, then gestured to a chair. Her voice sounded muffled, distant, as if it came from somewhere far away. "Sit down, Michael. I know who you are. Incense is part of the ritual, as are mirrors, candles, and other paraphernalia." A wave of nasty shivers ran down Michael's spine. Why had he agreed to this? What next? This one would probably take a tambourine and start bouncing around him with songs. Meanwhile, Melanie asked the guest to describe the problem in detail. "What, to say everything?" the businessman asked anxiously. Melanie hummed strangely and continued. "Sure. Imagine it's a confession or a doctor's appointment." Michael swallowed convulsively and, choosing his words carefully, began to describe the essence of the problem. Of course, he did not mention that in the recent past he intended to remove his wife and become sole owner of the business. Melanie, however, was not so stupid as not to read between the lines. After a theatrical pause, she looked carefully into the eyes of her interlocutor and whispered, "Take the mirror." Yes, the one on the corner of the table. Look in it, and there you will see what you are looking for." Michael shook his head unhappily, but did not refuse. His eyes were watering from that damned basil, his throat was sore, and he felt as if he wanted to fall through the ground. Michael looked in the mirror and saw nothing, except his face, of course, which showed signs of sleep deprivation and alcohol abuse, especially in the evenings. There was a mute question in Michael's eyes. The fortune teller smiled and asked quietly, "Well, do you see in the mirror, Michael?" The businessman's cheeks flared with anger. "What do I see? Myself, of course. Who else? Is this some kind of joke?" The fortune teller suddenly stood up from the table and hovered over him like a ghost. "That's right, you see yourself. And what do you see in yourself? What specific traits can you name?" Michael shook his head incomprehensibly, but it was impossible to stop her. Approaching almost closely, she said in an icy tone, "I see a liar, a traitor, and a failed murderer. Don't you?" Michael turned pale and almost collapsed from his chair. The fortune teller's voice seemed vaguely familiar to him, especially in that tone. Where had he heard it before? Melanie laughed triumphantly, then pulled off her veil and removed her red wig. Michael gasped. "And Amanda? Was it really you? How is that even possible?" Amanda, and it was really her, smiled and began to carefully wipe off the remnants of her makeup. A little later, she said, "Yes, it's really me, as you can see, alive and well. In fact, I knew for a long time that you wanted to get rid of me. I just wanted to catch you in the act. But don't frown. It doesn't suit you. You probably would have got what you wanted if it wasn't for one thing. But thanks to Terrence, the head of security. I helped his son sincerely, out of love for his children, and he, a kind soul, gave me all your secrets as a reward." Michael clenched his fists until his fingers ached and rose from his chair. "I'm going to smash you and that Terrence and his family, the bastard." Amanda took 2 steps back and waved her hands in protest. "Don't even think about it, honey. Do you really think I'm that stupid? There's a recording device in the room, and it's going to the police. So I wouldn't advise you to get your hands dirty." Michael punched the air with his palm in impotent anger, and Amanda, savoring the moment of victory, said, "You didn't even bother to come to the lineup, even though there wasn't one. You essentially put an empty coffin in the ground, honey. All thanks to Terrence. His little boy's such a good boy, he likes to draw. He's in art class. And you still haven't realized the simple truth. The businessman shook his head contritely and then turned his gaze to his wife, who had outsmarted him on all fronts. So who is still the heir in the event of your death? Or was it all a sham from start to finish? Amanda stepped closer and smiled an open smile. An heir. And the heir was none other than your head of security, Terrence. What, you didn't expect that? You've probably heard the story of my missing brother. Well, Terrence is my brother. Surprising, isn't it? After my son got sick, I asked Terrence to find my brother. We were separated when we were 2 years old. You know, the orphanage director kept it quiet. But Terrence got on the trail, got on himself. I mean, he was always a big boy. So he grew up to be a big boy. The door behind Michael's back opened quietly, and in the doorway appeared the formidable figure of the head of security, surrounded by police officers. Only now the businessman realized that he had fallen into a trap set by his cunning wife and his newfound brother Terrence. Amanda smiled at her brother and dialed the number of the director of the orphanage. "Hello, Mr. Norman? It's Amanda. How are Kevin's adoption papers coming along? Are they ready?" Yeah, him. Are they ready? Oh, that's great. I'll be right there. Wait for it." The fortnight flew by. The case with Michael's detention had traveled all the news sites of the region and had already become tiresome when Nicholas came to the clinic to pick up his dog. Dick's recovery was ahead of him. There was no one to help him. Immediately after the detention of her lover, Betty packed her bags and returned to her hometown in the east of the country. In fact, she was not pregnant at all. However, this news could not help Michael anyway. Nicholas, on the day of Dick's discharge from the clinic, was an unexpected surprise. When the boy, hardly containing his excitement, stepped over the threshold, the elderly vet only smiled and shrugged his shoulders in embarrassment. "You'll forgive me, please, but the dog has already been taken away." Nicholas flinched. "What do you mean, taken away? That's just impossible. It's my dog. Do you hear me? Don't pause. Tell me, please, where is he?" The man suddenly smiled and, unable to hide the truth, nodded towards the street. Nicholas turned round and saw 3 people standing in front of the clinic, or rather 4 if you counted his pet. Amanda, Kevin, and Mr. Oliver were holding hands and beckoning him to join their company. Standing a little further away was Terrence, who was looking lovingly at his baby sister. It was good that they had found each other after all. Nicholas smiled and jumped out and began hugging everyone in turn. When he met Amanda's gaze, he lowered his eyes, but the businesswoman understood everything and did not hurry things up. In fact, she knew almost everything about Nicholas, and first of all from Kevin and his grandfather. There was a reason they say that the truth is spoken by the mouth of a child, and that meant that she and Nicholas would be fine. But now the young people were just enjoying life in each other's company, knowing perfectly well that a very happy life with their son Kevin, grandfather Mr. Oliver, and of course, Dick was ahead of them.
Darkness had always seemed to Angelica a living thing, and as long as she could remember, she knew that something lurked in it, waiting for the fateful moment, something that wanted to harm her. "You are quite big now," her mother said to her, putting her to bed for the night and carefully adjusting the blanket. "Don't you realize there's nothing there?" "It's all right here, silly," her mother said, tapping Angelica's forehead affectionately with her finger. "Come on, grow up soon and nothing to be afraid of." On this inclement, thunderous night, standing in front of the window, the girl remembered her mother, who was gone a little more than a month ago. The still young woman had faded away in a matter of weeks after doctors had told her she had cancer. How had they looked it up? Nobody knew. Just Angelica's mom thought that fatigue is from work, from household chores. And now her daughter is all alone. Wrapping her arms around her shoulders, she pressed her forehead against the cold glass and stared into the darkness, the first floor of the house, and it seems that there, beyond the window, the abyss. It was well past midnight on the clock, but Angelica didn't even think about going to bed until the footsteps, the fumbling of her stepfather in the next room, were hushed. He was drunk again, and when he was drunk, Angelica was almost more afraid of him than of what lived in the dark. In fact, John had demanded that she call him Daddy from the very beginning as soon as he entered the family 4 years ago. But Angelica had never uttered the word for him. Yes, she didn't know her real father. Her mother had never told her anything about him, but John, never could he be a real daddy to her. And no amount of candy and toys and sweet words about how much he loved his girl could change that. And when he tried to give her a kindred hug, Angelica felt the grip of a snare. Angelica learned about snare, by the way, early because her grandfather kept one in his collection of antiques. Grandpa had his own room, and it always seemed to Angelica a cave of treasures. What wasn't there? Huge books, colorful rugs, strange pictures that her grandfather Robert called engravings. A big globe, not at all like the ones at school. And about the huge trap, her grandfather said it was a 19th century antique. When Angelica was little, she couldn't understand what the 19th century was. Even what her grandfather said didn't help. It was a time so long ago when even his own grandfather had been a baby. Robert also said that this trap had once been used to hunt special, magical wolves. But Mama didn't like that kind of talk. She said that because of them, Angelica would never stop being afraid of the dark. Mom sometimes even demanded to throw this thing away, saying that even though it lies on the shelf, but still somehow uncomfortable, the aura in the house is spoiled. But grandfather only waved away and said that the aura, if it is at all in nature, spoiled people, but not things with a good family history. Daughter. Stepfather's quiet voice at the door pulled Angelica out of her silent stupor. She shuddered and turned around. Angelica, open up to Daddy. You're awake. Are you afraid of a thunderstorm, little girl? The nightlight is on. There. She clenched her teeth. What kind of little girl is she to him? A week ago she turned 18. But no celebration, of course. Shortly after her mother's funeral, no wish. Just that day had passed, and that was it. Her stepfather only got drunk in it again and kept repeating that time flies, and she for him will always remain a daddy's daughter who belongs only to him. In general, the stepfather said strange things when he was drunk, and when he was sober, he did strange things. For example, he loved to move things from one place to another. For example, the mug Angelica used to drink tea from in the morning, and then began to say that no, he did not touch anything. It is with her head something apparently is not so. Go away, please. I'm tired. I want to sleep. Go away, you're drunk. Angelica's voice sounded unsure. The stepfather outside the door seemed to run his fingernails over the door. No, the stepfather exhaled hoarsely and the door opened. He stepped into the room, closed the door. What are you running from me for, huh? I won't hurt my girl. The stepfather licked his lips and Angelica felt nauseous. Suddenly, his hand reached out and put out the nightlight. Small in the form of a lantern, from which on the walls danced figures of forest animals and close to the stars. It was a gift from my mother long ago, and every night burned until morning. Turn it back on. Angelica's voice trembled. She couldn't bring herself to move from her seat. No, it wasn't completely dark in the room after all. There were lights burning in the yard, and the lightning seemed to strike without ceasing. But the disappearance of the source of warm, soothing light struck a whiplash on her nerves. Afraid of the dark girl. The stepfather was getting closer. What do you want? Let's talk tomorrow. I'm tired, Anne. Do you want to go to bed, my girl? The stepfather licked his lips again and hiccuped drunkenly. Angelica gasped, her body trembling. If now to rush forward and jump out into the hallway. You can wake grandfather. He will calm him down. Grandfather, though he was already 70, was not afraid of John and always protected his daughter and granddaughter from his drunken antics. Except that the stepfather was ahead of Angelica and rushed first, right at her. He dug into her shoulders, pressed her against him, turned her around and pushed her onto the bed. Her scream froze, not breaking through the sweaty hand clamped over her mouth. What, do you think you become a big girl and can disobey your father? She's already 18. So everything is possible, popped stepfather. Angelica desperately resisted, but the forces, trivial simply by the weight of her stepfather and her, were not equal. The belt buckle jingled. Tears in the girl's eyes clouded everything around. Nightmare, darkness, the worst fears that she hadn't allowed to fully materialize in her head until now had become reality. Angelica snapped out a low, pitiful moan, but the one who hovered over her, It did not stop, only seemed to inflame even more. A big one, so muttered the stepfather in a slurred tongue. You're already out with the boys, aren't you? And Daddy then aside, well, nothing. I'll teach you how to obey. And suddenly the door opened. The light on in the hallway illuminated the figure on the threshold. Grandpa. In an instant, he was beside her, and then some force simply yanked her stepfather off Angelica, tossed him aside like a sack of garbage. Barely, with difficulty, she realized it was her grandfather who had done it. But he always seemed so weak, and here, sitting up on the bed and correcting, returning the pajama shirt torn by a ruthless hand to her bare shoulders, Angelica opened her eyes and watched as her stepfather, who had barely begun to rise, took flight again, now against the wall. Grandfather just stamped him and then hit him in the face with a full swing. John yelled something, tried to swing his fists back, but the forces were not equal, and in addition, he was tangled in his own pants. Finally, Grandfather gave him a final, from the heart, as they call it, a blow, from which the stepfather just howled and began to roll on the floor. And the next powerful blow, Grandfather clearly deprived him of his senses. Angelica, the grandfather turned to his granddaughter. Get dressed. Grandpa, she started, but the stern look immediately canceled any talk and slowness. The girl grabbed a sweater, jeans. Grandpa grabbed her stepfather by the scruff of the neck and lifted him off the floor. Not exactly carrying him, but dragging him. Grandpa, don't kill him, Angelica exclaimed. Well, what are you? Grinned the old man. Teaching enough for a start. What we will do. What are we going to do? Angelica froze. We'll leave. Right now. What? Oh, granddaughter. I should have waited for nothing. I thought maybe he would come to the senses. You see, he's lost his human face. No, we're leaving now. I've already decided where to. You obey your grandfather and pack your things. I'll call a cab and I'll lock him in the back room. He'll wake up in the morning, knock on the neighbor's balcony. He won't be lost. He'll live. Although, such a creature. With a hum, Grandfather disappeared into the corridor. Angelica acted, feeling as if in a dream. Take out the bag. Leave what was at hand. Oh, how lucky that recently in the room put in order and at least did not have to look for long documents and all the necessary little things. The tears had not dried up yet, but the girl was laughing nervously. What's going on? 5 minutes ago, she was suffocating under the disgusting weight of someone else's body, and now she's packing. Where to? Why now? Anyway, she didn't want to stay in this house. Mommy, you're gone, the girl whispered and slammed the desk drawer shut, grabbing her mother's last but most precious box. It was an antique, carved thing, in which she kept memorable little things different, as she herself said. And when Angelica was just a little girl, she loved to play with them, going through them as if the contents of a treasure chest. Ready, Dragonfly? Grandpa's back. Far away in the apartment, there were drunken shouts of her stepfather, who had apparently already come to his senses and was pounding on the door, locked in the room. Instead of answering, Angelica nodded. She went out into the corridor, then to the landing. Grandfather didn't lock the front door, just closed it. Now to the elevator and down. Why are we leaving? Where to? Angelica asked when they stopped at the elevator. Robert didn't answer right away. He opened his umbrella to hide himself and his granddaughter from the rain, then stretched out his hand and caught the cold stream of water in his hand and hummed, rubbing it between his fingers. He'd been thinking about it for a long time, about how it couldn't go on like this. Robert was silent when his daughter Celine decided to get back together with John. She decided, as she said herself, tired of being a woman alone. I brought up Angelica. She will be an adult soon. She will leave and what? I will be all alone then, she said indignantly and at the same time justifying herself. Yes, I made a mistake. I made a terrible mistake. My whole life was damaged. But what am I to do now? To be alone till death? Daddy, who needs me like this? There are so many young men, and here's a stranger's child, and even stranger, with strange things. No, John's not the best man in the world, but if he isn't, I'm afraid this is my last chance. Robert didn't argue. He kept the family together for so many years. I mean, he denied his daughter the right to a private life. Where with a kind word, and where with strictness, he had convinced her that Angelica's upbringing was her main task, her duty as a good mother. He thought, so really, it will be better. A small family lived, and as that, sometimes even like it seemed that they were happy. Angelica's mom was so young when her daughter was born, only 20 years old, and it was not a planned child. And the father of the daughter, it was possible to consider that there is no at all. That is, roughly speaking, biologically, of course, he existed. But in that murky, dirty, cruel story revealed enough burning truths that Selena refused any connection with this man. Only her father trusted the truth, and he, feeling immensely guilty for allowing what had happened, agreed with her. Although he sometimes realized that no, he could not have prevented it. To be more precise, he could have. If Selena had told him everything at once, instead of being alone with her misfortune. In general, the father-daughter bond could have broken, split like an iceberg under the impact of waves, but it was Angelica's appearance that became the saving glue for her. The baby gave them strength, gave their lives meaning. Angelica had been dusted off. No daycare why when there's a grandfather who, possessing a sharp, developed mind, taught the little girl to count and write, looked after her, and along the way before he retired and after, generously spent on her most of his salary. She was his historian and culturologist, specializing in folklore, not that great, but with what the accountant received Selena for the needs of the family was enough. Angelica grew up a quiet, domestic child. She went to school, but she did not make many new friends. In general, with her and in the yard drove few people. Not because of her odd fear of the dark and a sensitive attitude to the fact that sometimes count the surrounding objects were so noticeable, no. About it only the closest knew. Simply Angelica was very timid, shy, did not show initiative in games, but she studied well. She obeyed her mother, and Mom was quite happy with that. She only sometimes regretted that there is no in her daughter a bright palette of emotions, that fire that happens in other children. But then every time mentally said to herself that even be happy about it should be. Maybe the daughter of her mistakes will not repeat. I wish Angelica never had to go through what she went through in her time. Grandfather Robert also saw how his granddaughter was growing up, but it did not bother him in the least, because he noticed something else. Angelica was so sensible and intelligent beyond her years. So what if she doesn't run around the yard with the other kids, but as Peanuts cracking tasks from math and physics textbooks, eagerly argues with him, an old man about the deep meanings of the legends of Eastern Europe, and by heart can retell the most important dates in the history of Constantinople, not forgetting all the names of important persons of that time. Sometimes the granddaughter talked to her grandfather about the future, about what she wants to become, and every time she kept saying that she wants to be like him, also to study history, culture, folklore. Wouldn't you get bored? Robert asked with a sly squint. It's more work in the office. It's not an adventure with treasures, as in the movies. But it's interesting, answered Angelica invariably. And you can work very much alone. What are you? You do not like human society. Are you a bear? Which and alone in the wilderness of the forest is good? Once asked his granddaughter grandfather. And if I am a bear? Replied Angelica. He is big. No one will hurt him. No, grandfather, I love people. It's just, I think I'm something else. You're the only one, Robert grinned, and the best granddaughter I've ever had. And that, believe me, is even more important than science. And even if you become a fool and forget your alphabet and your name, I will always and always love you. Much later, looking back, Robert thought that he would not have allowed that Selena got together with John. But as if an evil fate, then Robert spent almost 2 months in the hospital, first finding himself there with pneumonia, and then, on the eve of discharge, had a heart attack. And when he returned to the apartment, it turned out that Selena not only brought a man, but also had time to sign with him. And she was determined that this was her last chance at womanhood, and she demanded that John be registered in the apartment. She said that if she didn't, she'd leave. She'd pack up her things and her daughter, and she and her husband would leave. Robert, with a broken heart, agreed to everything, but he kept an eye on his son-in-law. Scolded him when he drank in the first years. John as if obeyed. He worked, however, in different places, then a loader, then a guard at the warehouse. But Selena blossomed with him. She started wearing makeup and dresses, cooked a delicious dinner for the return of the spouse because she worked near the house and had time to patronize. Selena never tired of talking about how happy she was. Robert, after his illness, when one led to the other, suddenly began to feel guilty. That because of the long-standing fatal disobedience of his daughter and a keen desire to take care of his granddaughter, condemned Selena to a lonely woman's life. Robert had repeatedly told John that he was a stranger here and had no right to bring up Angelica, in general should not get too close to her. "What are you going to do to me, old man?" John snapped at him. "You yourself will fall apart soon. You don't get out of hospitals." Actually, that was only half true. Robert was really old. He tried to take care of his health. He was a head taller than his son-in-law, broader than him in the shoulders, and in principle, he never complained of feeling ill after he came out of the hospital. Robert always believed that men in their family were strong. His own great-grandfather had lived until he was 104 years old and had kept a large farm in the village until the last, commanding everyone so that even the mice went on a string. Robert did not run himself ate without excesses. Morning began with exercise and even went to the gym, bought a subscription. Which, by the way, very funny, Selena. If you want your father to be an old man, then I'm sorry, my daughter, there will be no such thing. Yes, he's sick, like all people. But is that a reason to suddenly abandon yourself? Time passed, and one day Robert realized no. John was looking at Angelica for a reason. The bastard suddenly began to throw phrases that here she will be 18, will be a bride, will be a girl in the very juice, and it must, therefore, from the grooms to protect. Robert could not listen to how Selena takes these speeches as a joke, even happy that stepfather, you see, ready in advance to protect the honor of stepdaughter. When it became clear that Selena is sick, Robert suggested let's sell the apartment, start treatment. He also offered to sell his house in the village, but she was against it. "No, I can't do that to Angelica. This is her future. She needs a good place to live. And me, I guess it's my time. I guess it's for the way I used to be." Robert felt like hitting her for the only time in his life, just to slap her so she'd come to her senses and stop talking nonsense, because he'd long ago decided for himself that what had happened wasn't Selena's fault. She was just too young. She didn't go to anyone for help. They could have just left, fled to the city, and then, after his daughter's death, the only reason Robert didn't collapse into the black abyss of despair was because he knew Angelica needed his help. He realized that with John further to live under the same roof they cannot. He was not ashamed to drink at home, and on all attempts to talk shouted that he was in grief and in general he was registered here. Robert decided to do otherwise, to move out, taking Angelica with him of course, and then already sell the apartment. Slowly began to learn everything, and the place where to leave, prepared. But here's how it all turned out, that I had to hurry. And now when they were standing at the entrance, all these events and decisions of the past flashed before their eyes. "Grandpa, where are we going? Maybe we should go back in." "Okay, Dragonfly, listen to me." Robert turned to his granddaughter and put his hand on her shoulder. "I thought I'd tell you everything later. Well, as it is now, we can no longer live with this man. You yourself, a big girl, should realize what he's like. I'm an old man, of course, but I'll take care of you. There's a place where we can stay while we decide everything. We'll leave town." "Grandpa, what about it? I have to prepare to enter next year." "What about me? There's a library in town." Angelica did not realize that her thoughts were occupied with such trivial matters of the future, but they rose up in her mind like a barrier protecting her from the aftertaste of the attack. "You will," Robert answered. "The time is September. You'll have plenty of time to get ready for admission." "I'm sorry, Dragonfly," he added more quietly. "I should have taken you away earlier. The old fool. I kept thinking that I had to finish this and that. To hell with everything, just to keep you safe." "It's not your fault, Grandpa." Angelica's voice trembled. "Why did Mom bring him? He's your mom just loved and did not listen to her mind. It happens in life." "Well, granddaughter, do not cry. I want to go back and unscrew his head." Angelica sobbed and hugged her grandfather. "Don't. Let's really just go away, even to the end of the world." "And where are we going?" "To your friends." "No, Dragonfly. We'll go to my small homeland, to the village of Boers." Ooh, that's all the girl could say. She would have been less surprised if her grandfather had said that they were going, say, to Paris. Angelica knew that this village was somewhere far away, but she had never been there. Her grandfather had once told her, when she was still a little girl, about those places, about how free and beautiful it was there. But then Mom heard it and yelled at Grandpa. She said she shouldn't tell her daughter about it. She'd had enough of that damn place. But it was such vague, ancient memories, and Angelica did not ask anything about it now. The abominable attack of her stepfather had put the girl into some sort of trance. She was now ready for anything, just to be away from here. Finally, the cab pulled up. The driver, a chatty and smiling guy who introduced himself as Vasily, loaded the passengers' things and under the story about what an unusual shift he had today, took them to the station. And the owner of the pug said to me, "Don't worry, we are calm today. What does he do when he's not calm?" I do not envy her husband. Gilbert the guy, carefully taking a place in the parking lot. "That's it, here we are. What time is the train there?" "We'll make it," answered Robert, counting out the bills with a bounty for the trip and for tea. "Grandpa, have you bought tickets already?" Angelica was surprised. "No, but the nearest one is leaving." Robert glanced at his wristwatch. "In 3 hours. If there are no tickets for it, then we'll go next." "Grandpa, will he? Will he be looking for us?" "Who knows? But don't be afraid," smiled the old man. "I won't let him hurt you. Now let's get to the Boers, rest, and slowly get on with our lives. Look, Dragonfly, there's a 24-hour buffet. What do you say about the pies? Unhealthy, fried, but tasty." "I will," smiled Angelica. Luckily, the train tickets were available. Robert paid for a whole compartment at once so that not a single living soul would not interfere with the journey. Unfortunately, we don't have grilled chicken and boiled eggs, but there is a restaurant car, so we won't starve. "Give me that bag, granddaughter. Careful, put it here." Something jingled in the bag. Robert carefully placed it. Angelica frowned. It felt like a box. "Grandfather, is there a trap in there?" Robert nodded. "Grandpa, you told Mom you were going to throw it out." "Yeah, that came out badly, but that memory is mine." "That trap? What's that?" "Oh, Dragonfly? I'll tell you later, but for now, he doesn't ask for food and drink, and he won't jump out from under the shelf, won't bite, right? So forget him for now, forget him. Let's better make the bed, and you go to sleep, or look, quite sleepy eyes." Angelica agreed. Now, under the measured clatter of wheels, when with every moment the train carried away farther and farther, she suddenly felt so tired. Still, however, wanted to wash to wipe with a washcloth all traces of touching stepfather, but now it was impossible, and therefore could wait. Early in the morning, when the dawn was already dawning, Grandfather woke Angelica to admire the view outside the window. It was really a breathtaking sight. The train was rushing past the river, on a vast meadow in front of which cows were grazing. Summer was running, flying to the end, and the cattle were walking on the last succulent grasses. A little later, they took tea, and breakfast was served by the conductor, and Angelica plunged into what she loved more than anything else in the world, Grandfather's story. He told her what they would soon pass by, and then the view of a half station or some village acquired a special, deep, and fascinating meaning. "What are we going to do there, Grandfather?" "To live, granddaughter. We spent too long in the city, and you've never seen anything but it in your life. I have a house there." "A real one?" Angelica gasped. "Well, not a toy," Robert grinned. "It was built more than a century ago. It has a solid piece of land. True, almost everything stood unattended." "What do you mean, almost?" "Well, there were people to keep an eye on things so they didn't fall apart. But all in all, we'll live in a wilderness, granddaughter. But believe me, that's what will do our hearts good now." The road took a long time. Sometimes we went out at small stations to stretch our legs, and also Grandfather always bought something to fried seeds or homemade dry fish. Angelica tried it all with apprehension and even tears. Mom would not approve cooked by unknown person, unknown in what conditions. But Angelica also believed her favorite grandfather. "Grandpa, well, what kind of village is this?" Angelica said in surprise, diving out of the screen of the smartphone, in which she had been sitting for the last half an hour. Almost a city already. Yes, the Boers have changed, but fortunately, civilization is slowly coming and the spirit of the old, as they call it, lives. And you, what are you? Quite urban at me. What else? Angelica shrugged her shoulders. Ed, that's what I mean. Consider, the real life has not seen. No, I should have been more determined and at least sometimes to bring you. Look, and would not have grown up such a boo. Sending her grandfather a smile that understood his joke, Angelica returned to the information she was studying. In general, it was very interesting. The first settlements on the place of Kabankiki appeared at least 400 years ago, and still in these parts remained a lot of architectural monuments of the 19th and even 18th centuries. The house of the merchant Volko, now turned into a museum, where the objects of old times and some archaeological finds were demonstrated. Not far from the village, the reserved territories began, and probably, as it was said in one of the articles, it was the proximity of truly untouched nature that explained the fact that the forests were not reserved, but the most ordinary, almost adjacent to the Kabankiki, were so unmodern. In other words, they were happy in the proper seasons with an abundance of berries and mushrooms, and there were also all sorts of animals, hares, martens, and even moose, and someone said wolves. In the latter, however, the journalist who wrote the article doubted very much and specified that wolves had not been officially seen in these parts for 100 years, so that all these stories were no more true than the rumors about werewolves that had been going around in Kabanchiki for ages. Grandpa, is there a fence at our house? Angelica suddenly asked. There is a good fence. It's good enough to keep out strange cattle. Are the doors and windows locked? Why do you ask, granddaughter? Are you afraid of robbers? Playing mysteriously with his eyebrows, grandfather asked, and Angelica smiled involuntarily. It's just that we will live alone. Don't be afraid. Outside bandits don't climb there. Thieves too in Kabankiki. There are no for about 30 years. Why? If you know too much, the Martins will take you to the forest. Grandfather said something incomprehensible and wagged his finger at his granddaughter. Angelica shrugged her shoulders and changed her occupation, though she had few people who could be called friends in the city, and it was necessary, of course, to inform them that she had left. At last the train stopped. The usual fuss began to take things, check that nothing had been forgotten and come back for what had been forgotten. Then we waited for the bus and, having mixed up a little, almost went in the opposite direction. In short, by the time we finally reached Kabanchiki, Angelica felt tired. But of course she looked at the sides, at what opened her eyes. It was hard to say that it was a village if we were to be guided by a classical idea of it. Asphalted road, modern buildings, post office, stores. In the distance could be seen the roofs of solid such houses. Robert explained that it was squeezed into the territory of Kabanchiki Cottage Village, like a cottage, but with a considerable number of such properties in which they live all year round. But soon all this was left aside. The air was fresh and possibly fragrant, filled with the aroma of meadow grasses. The wind carried the freshness of the river and the distant mooing of cows. Angelica suggested taking the cab when they first got off the bus, but Robert said it was ridiculous to walk 5 minutes. But it must have been half an hour, and with the way the luggage was dragging their hands, it seemed like an eternity. They passed all the houses in the village. Angelica felt strange, because they did not stare at them, but some of the old men suddenly began to say something to others at their appearance. Angelica suddenly thought about the fact that her grandfather never really told about his past life. That is, about the time before he moved to the city, and it now seemed strange. After all, with Robert, it seems, granddaughter about everything in the world could communicate. So why wasn't this period of his life covered? I could not believe that his grandfather had nothing to tell about his youth, but what he told was scraps, as if from the ancient story torn out pieces, erased some of the words and so presented, and unclear to you and curious to the horror of what is there, in fact, what is there. Wow, Grandpa, is that your house? Marveled Angelica. When finally they got out of the village, or rather left the last of its houses a few hundred meters behind them, grandfather and granddaughter stopped in front of a 2-story brick house with a tile, once must have been red, but now lost the richness of color roof. The windows were boarded up. The paint had peeled off on the walls, revealing the brickwork. The girl thought suddenly that the house looked like a huge, lying in hibernation beast. A long period of idleness had made it quite heavy, clumsy, and the fur on its sides had piled up, in some places falling out, exposing the base of the hide. What nonsense comes to mind sometimes. Shaking her head and shrugging her shoulders, Angelica approached the wrought iron fence, covered with some greenery, touched the black bars with her fingers. It seemed that it had been painted at least last year. Otherwise, it would have rusted for so many years. There was a shrill, howling squeak. Grandfather opened the lock on the gate, and now with effort pushed it forward, opening it. "Welcome to our domain," he said importantly to his granddaughter, lifting his hat above his head. Grandfather had always, for as long as Angelica could remember, loved hats. And in summer he always wore light-colored sailcloth hats, which made him, together with his neat beard and mustache, look like an ancient professor. This resemblance, by the way, even did not spoil the habit of grandfather to wear under suits not shirts with ties, and t-shirts from youth stores bright, with bold prints and bold inscriptions. The porch of the house inspired apprehension, but it didn't fail when Angelica climbed it. It was her turn to unlock the doors, and they creaked open with an equally shrill creak. "Oh, what a mess." Robert shook his head. "I'm going to have to work here." "Is there heating?" Angelica asked, suddenly worried about the comfort of her new home. "From the boiler in the basement. I bought a new boiler 3 years ago, but it was idle." The girl only shook her head. It was surprising and strange that the grandfather cared so much about the place where no one lived for many years, in which they did not even go on vacation. True, now it became clear that when grandfather left, as he said, on business, he probably came here to see how the house was. A spacious hallway with a wide staircase going to the second floor created the illusion that the house was much more spacious than it seemed from the outside. Watching her grandfather, Angelica thought that he took such an abrupt departure much more calmly than she did. With a most nonchalant look, armed with the appropriate tools, Robert proceeded to open the windows. Not all of them, of course, he said, but he would first make the rooms they needed habitable, and then do the rest. "Here's the kitchen." Grandpa walked his granddaughter through the house like a master tour guide. "We cook with gas, so tomorrow I'll go to the village shop for a cylinder." "Grandpa, the village shops are over. That's the old name," shyly corrected him Angelica. "Well, to the store. The essence is the same. Everything can be bought." The kitchen slightly frightened Angelica. Gas stoves seemed to her in principle beasts incomprehensible in handling. And the place was so dirty. "Yes, we need to clean well," as if her grandfather read her thoughts, "so that we do not suffer. I'll bring tomorrow a worker from the village will help us. Come on, I'll show you the living room." "Grandpa, it's just like in a museum," aghast the girl, when from the furniture were pulled down accompanied by rising clouds of dust, which had become white and beige from time, cloth covers. Angelica had noticed even earlier that inside the house looked very old-fashioned. Under the ceilings there was fanciful molding with bunches of grapes and some figures of either people or animals, and now the furniture was found, natural wood it seems. The girl ran her fingertips over the lacquered surface, sighed, unthinkable, and all this beauty was idle for years. She even felt sorry for the house. It was a strange thought, but Angelica thought that if it was not just a building, but a living being, it would probably be a shame for it to exist alone like this without owners. "Is the fireplace real?" I asked my grandfather, and he answered with a nod. Then we went to the second floor, where according to Robert there were living rooms, and a couple of guest rooms, and also a study. "Well, let's take these," the old man decided, showing his granddaughter the two rooms next to each other. And although he said nothing, it seemed to her that her room had once belonged to a woman. It was indicated by the look of the bed. Its 4 posts were covered with carvings with floral ornaments, and there was a table with a triple mirror against the wall. The girl wrinkled her nose at the wallpaper, which must have come from the 50s, but in this room on the wall by the bed, it was literally falling off, and it was clumping up alarmingly. But since she was going to live here now, or rather live here for a while, she had to put up with everything. And to get used to it, Angelica decided to put some of her things in the room as soon as possible. Her mother's jewelry box on the table with mirrors, her favorite nightlight on the bedside table. The girl froze. Then she rummaged through her bag once more. The nightlight was gone. No, it was not lost. She left it in the room of the city apartment. Forgot. Oh, dragonfly. Like a little girl, honestly. Sighed grandfather when Angelica shared her sadness with him. But it's not good to sleep with the light. Grandfather, please don't start, Angelica said, almost crying. She herself realized how stupid it is, 18 years old already and afraid of the dark, but she couldn't help herself. I'm not swearing. Robert waved his hands. It's nothing like that. Before, in the old days, even adults were afraid of the dark. It was normal, especially in villages like this one. He added more quietly, and then hugged his granddaughter. Well, keep the phone on at night. Put it on the nightstand. I'll look in the village shop tomorrow. Maybe they have lamps, or you could light a candle. No. Angelica calmed down and even smiled. I don't want a candle. What if there's a fire? And in the old days, how did they live with them, eh? And nothing did not burn everything and everywhere. So then, probably skillfully. That's right, Robert nodded. In the old days, we lived without the internet, but in many ways we were smart, and in some ways we understood more than we do today. Well, now that we've looked around, granddaughter, let's walk back to the village and get something for dinner. I'd order sushi too. Grandpa added in a hooligan tone. But I'm afraid the delivery zone doesn't extend to the Boers. You should get some rest, Grandpa. Angelica hated to be weak. After all, she's so young and Grandpa's old. Why don't I go? You just write down what to buy. Okay, you agree? Before going to the store, still found out that the water supply in the house again has heating from the boiler, and in principle the quality of water is not frightening. So Angelica went shopping almost in a good mood. It was nice and strange at the same time to walk along the empty road, listening to the silence. No, of course, the silence was not absolute, but against the background of the city noise seemed just fantastic. As it turned out, there were several stores in Kabanchiki, but Angelica was lucky to go straight to the largest one, where everything on the list was available, and also, to her delight, nightlights were available. Angelica chose the one in the shape of a bear in linden pink color. The saleswoman behind the counter did not interfere with questions, but still asked if it was true that Robert had returned. They said they saw him, walking towards the manor. Well, Angelica stretched out, not really knowing what to say. We won't be long. To rest. Fine, said the saleswoman and looked at her strangely. Give him a bow from us Sidorops, and tell him the walkers still live here too. And the stones remember. I will, Angelica rounded her eyes. She hadn't expected her grandfather to be such a famous person, but apparently just lived here his peers, and maybe he wrote them letters. Finally, loaded with bags, Angelica went outside. The sun was slipping towards sunset, having changed the gold of light to a soft crimson tone. The girl was suddenly touched by the thought that dusk would soon come. Surely she would make it back before they did. How annoyed she was with her own silly, groundless fears. The road home was winding ahead in a ribbon. Angelica passed a woman with a full basket, by the look of it, of the early mushroom harvest, and the girl made a note in her mind to offer her grandfather to go mushrooming. 4 goats also passed by. The animals kept in a flock, and drove them barefooted boy, who paid no attention to the new resident of Kabanchiki, too absorbed in the fact that not to let run away his small herd, and in addition still hummed under his nose some song. Girl, do you need a ride? The rustle of tires of the car approaching from the back and the voice of the guy who stuck out from the driver's seat took Angelica out of the state of pleasant, almost meditative thoughtfulness. No, thank you, she replied politely and even smiled, and quickened her step a little. Not that Angelica was afraid, but it was somehow unpleasant when you are alone on the road, the darkness is getting closer, and behind you a car with 4 strange men crawls. What are you doing? One of the guys in the back nodded. Hop in, we'll give you a ride. Are you afraid? The driver grinned. Why so? Are you a city girl? Angelica shuddered. Only this is not enough. What to do now? Turn around and go back to the village where people are. Drop the heavy bags and run? Hey, what's the big deal? A new participant in the events unfolding in the dwindling twilight approached from the direction of the village, just like the car, but on a bicycle. It was a tall, blonde-haired guy wearing glasses with round, old-fashioned glasses, and Angelica, though the situation did not dispose to the thoughts of outsiders, but thought that he looked something like a student from the old Soviet movies that her grandfather liked to watch. Even dressed similarly, plaid shirt, vest on top, but the jeans and sneakers, of course, are quite a modern detail. "Hi, Alexander," gritted his teeth and averted his eyes the guy who was in the driver's seat of the car. "Nah, just offering a ride." Well. The blonde grinned and slowed down completely, stopped the bike, so that he was exactly between the car and Angelica. "Would you ride?" "Come on." Another guy from the car spoke up. "We didn't do anything wrong. I'm sorry." "All right, let's go, guys." And the next moment, the driver hit the gas and the car sped forward, and there, a lot farther on, turned at a fork, now heading somewhere towards the city, like somewhere. "Is everything all right?" The blonde turned to Angelica. "Thank you," she smiled. "Yes, you saved me." "No," he replied. "It's Max and his friends, they're locals. Hooligans, of course, but generally harmless guys. But their company seems to have frightened you." "If only a little. I really recently came here, only today. I came with my grandfather." Completely dared to communicate with the stranger Angelica and waved her hand, pointing to their house. "That's where we live." "Oh, so Robert's back," the boy said thoughtfully and sent Angelica a very strange look. "May I offer the chivalric services of a chaperone? We're kind of safe here in general, but still, I wouldn't want to interfere with your plans," Angelica said in a hurry and blushed embarrassed. "You're not interfering because I'm just out for a walk," the blonde replied. "I'll help with the bags at the same time." He patted the basket on the bike rack with his hand. "Thank you," Angelica agreed, still embarrassed. "If it really doesn't bother you. By the way, we haven't introduced ourselves." He held out his hand to her. "Alexander." "Angelica," answered the girl. The handshake was firm, and so they moved forward. They started talking, so about insignificant trifles, but by the time they reached the gate of the house, Angelica for some reason began to feel that she knew Alexander a long time ago. She opened the gate, expecting him to drive forward, but the guy stopped in front of them, unloaded the bags, returning them to the owner. "Maybe," Angelica swallowed nervously. "Would you come in to see us? You know, to say hello to Grandpa and have a cup of tea." "Thanks, but no. I have to go," answered the guy and looked very strange again. "Well, okay," shrugged Angelica. "Bye then. See you later." The guy replied and turned his bike around and rode back. Angelica decided not to tell her grandfather anything, because in fact, nothing particularly important or interesting had happened. They hastily prepared dinner sandwiches, drank tea with cookies, and went to bed. Angelica slept unexpectedly well at the new place. She had a wonderful dream, which was equally frightening and exciting because usually the girl saw something ordinary, a repetition of her everyday life, their routine. But here she was in the village, or rather in the yard of their house. Late autumn was raining on the trees left rare, brown, and dried, disturbing rustling leaves. Angelica stood in the yard, dressed only in a light dress, more suitable for the warm days of the passing summer. She stood and was afraid to turn to the house, because she knew inside none of the rooms no lights were on and something was watching her from the windows. Something big and evil. And then behind the gate, which opened by itself, as if under the hand of a ghost, there was a big dog. Black with silver fur, it grinned suddenly, and Angelica realized it was not just a dog. There was something of a wolf in it. The beast was formidable, but the girl knew for sure he would not offend. And then what was in the house? A dirty fog crept onto the porch, and the sky darkened sharply, twitched with storm clouds, and the air smelled her proximity. But the wind also dryly drove the leaves, did not spill a drop. Angelica took a step forward, another, snapped at a run in terror, realizing that what is in the house is already reaching for her, is about to grab. She fell, pain hit her knees. She stretched her hands forward in despair, and her fingers sank into the thick, warm fur, and her gaze met the yellow eyes of the dog, in the depths of which smoldered red coals. The beast radiated strength, aggression, and hunger, but it did not want to hurt her. Angelica somehow knew that he wanted to save her, except he couldn't. Please, it was the kind of dream where you scream, tearing your voice, but barely a whisper comes out. Let me in, the wolf answered, his voice somehow sounding like the roar of a beast and a young man on a bicycle at the same time. Rang out right at the girl's head. I can't, said the wolf. First you have to invite me in. Angelica had already opened her mouth to say the cherished words, but then the fog caught up with her. It touched her ankles and yanked her back, and her stepfather's nasty voice sounded behind her. There you are, my girl. Angelica woke up, jumping up in bed and gasping for breath. Outside the window was a clear, golden dawn. The house became noticeably cooler. Probably it was worth adding heating. Pulling her knees to herself and wrapping her arms around them, the girl squeezed her eyes shut and shook her head, as if finally shaking off the dream. What a dream. In the morning, grandfather announced that he was going shopping, and also for an assistant. No need, Angelica said. I can do it myself. You think, Dragonfly? You're a hard-working bee and you know how to do everything, but there are a lot of worries here. Nothing, the girl answered cheerfully. There will be something to do. Will you be back quickly? Maybe we can go to the woods later for mushrooms. That's a good idea, smiled the grandfather. We'll do that. By the time he returned, Angelica, of course, had not managed to do everything, but still the most necessary rooms were cleaner. We went to the forest. It was fun, especially when the grandfather began to strictly correct his granddaughter's clothes, as it should be to ensure that no gnats or ticks did not bite. Angelica had a very vague idea of the mushroom variety in the wilderness, and so grandfather's detailed story about what you can eat here and what not, accompanied by all sorts of simply curious facts, came just right. Grandpa also told a little about the locals, and Angelica decided to open up about what happened yesterday. I don't know Alexander at all. Robert shook his head. But I think we should invite him to tea, if only as a courtesy. Tell him if you see me insisting. We walked in the forest until late afternoon, and there we had another snack of sandwiches and coffee from a thermos. They unanimously decided to have dinner with mushrooms and fried them with potatoes. Angelica's grandfather didn't let her do it. He said that there are dishes that he, doesn't trust anyone. At dinner, we did not utter a word too tasty. Everything was too delicious, impossible to distract. But then, when grandfather, again without any help, brewed a fragrant tea, it was time to talk. Robert told his granddaughter that they had come, of course, to rest, but it was also time to seriously deal with his life. I think it's time for you to learn something about our family and why your mother has been alone for so long. Perhaps I should have told you about it sooner, but I once made a vow to Celine not to tell you anything, but I think that was a mistake. I'll be honest, granddaughter, I feel like I'm betraying my daughter's memory, but I can't keep quiet. There are things you can let go of, but you must know, and we'll start from afar. It turned out that the ancestors of Angelica's family on her mother's side were scientists, at least in 4 generations, and all of them attracted not exact sciences, but history, literature, folklore. Therefore, in many ways they were happy to take in the family of Angelica's grandfather, because he did the same thing. Angelica's great-grandmother on her mother's side was, as it became fashionable to say in the modern world, psychic, and it brought her fame, but not particularly good. But personal happiness was not. In the end, this intelligent and talented woman, as Robert said, went crazy. Your mother was under the impression that this was not the first woman in your family named Gu, shall we say, had peculiarities of consciousness. Your aunt. Well, what's an aunt? My grandmother's next of kin, let's call her that, was sleepwalking. My wife, that is, your grandmother, she was afraid of water since childhood, and you know what fortune tellers told her? That she had drowned in a previous life, and she so believed that. So sorry for the details, but even the bath refused to take, and our vacation, if we went to the sea, turned into an unbelievable thing. She wouldn't even wet her feet. Grandfather, cautiously, fearfully even asked Angelica, do you think I'm afraid of the dark because I'm going crazy? No, well, what do you mean? The old man was indignant. It's just that you're an impressionable person, but I'm afraid some inclinations in women of our kind still have. Only, Angelica, here, I beg you, do not think that you go crazy. Rather, I repeat, you are extremely impressionable nature. And you in life contraindicated strong emotional shocks. And also, by the way, if you believe what went among the women of our family, you may have the gift of a psychic, a seer. I wouldn't want that. Angelica shrugged shakily, though the room was very warm. What happened to Mom? And with her, dear, what happened is this. And again, I'm sorry that you have to learn all this. Your mom fell in love with a man when she graduated. It was clearly a hopeless case, but she decided that he was a man destined by fate. I was ill with something like asthma at that time, and since I had the opportunity, I decided to move to the countryside to improve my health. At the same time, I began to teach the locals here. That is, there was a school here, everything. But I gave lessons, was, let's say, a tutor in history. I liked to collect local folklore. I'd even thought at one time to find treasure, according to legends buried here somewhere. And you can imagine, we found it. A pot with ancient coins. As I remember now, the reward was divided among everyone honestly. Oh, we had a week's walk then. Anyway, we came here. Selena was very sad that she left her beloved. But here's how it turned out. He was married and his wife was pregnant. So Selena decided to do the old-fashioned love spell, and she chose Alevtina as her assistant. We had such an old woman here, a mean one. She persuaded Selena to go to the forest at night, to the swamp, and there to do something dark. In general, when we returned to the city, the man himself began to run after Selena. I was worried about my daughter. Why did he change his mind about his love? And it turned out that he had a misfortune in the family. Wife lost a baby and doctors said that they will not have any more children. So he was probably looking for her replacement. Only the temper they had with Selena were not alike at all, and he began to swear at her often, offended. And then it turned out that he has another friend and here she is pregnant. Apparently, he was still when with his wife everything was fine, had an affair on the side. In general, he left my Selena. Oh, how many tears she shed for him. I thought that here, the next summer when we came here, then rest, fresh air will heal her. But I was wrong. Selena got it into her head that it was because of her sorcery that her wife lost her beloved child. I told her that this nonsense is rare, but she did not listen and kept saying that she would be punished for this. Karma would catch up with her. The time was not easy then, granddaughter. Not the heart of the 90s, of course, but in some places they were still on their feet. Bandits. Anyway, cottages were already being built in Kabankiki. Those who were richer were vacationing. And it so happened that my Selena started to go to the forest. The same Alevtina advised her, of course, not for free. Some rituals to remove the consequences of the spell. And one day Selena ran into bandits in the woods. They were having some kind of showdown. In general, it was a bad business, but it so happened that the leader liked her. He said he'd let her go as anyway, she had to lie down with him so he could pretend she wasn't there, so that he'd quiet his men who were afraid. She'd tell someone what she'd seen. Here, she went to this man for several days. More precisely, she ran away in the evenings and came back in the morning. She revealed herself to me when they were already back in town, and it became clear that she was expecting a child. That's how, granddaughter, you appeared. Angelica listened, and it seemed to her that grandfather, of course, about another person, because, well, it could not all relate to her favorite mother, to herself. But the realization that it was true and it was all about her, her family, still came over her. Robert paused and then, reading from his granddaughter's look that she understood everything, continued. He tried to find that man, but it turned out that the leader had run away. Someone had gotten into a fight, and he had to flee. And Celine told him not to look, not to anger. Angelica was tormented by ambivalent feelings that night. On the one hand, she realized how important it was to understand what was happening to her mother. But on the other hand, now she knew for sure that her life would never be the same again. And it seemed that now there was something in her that confused everything even more, pushing her somewhere forward, into the darkness. The next day, grandfather said that he would be very busy. He had to call his friends in the city, who promised to find a good realtor, and also to send some documents on the apartment to slowly start a big deal to sell it. Not now, of course, but later, when the inheritance will all work out. But we have to start now. And what should I do? Angelica sighed. Oh, dragonfly. Really like a little. Well, think of a case. There you can continue to clean the house, you can cook dinner. Robert curled his fingers, enumerating, but then, seeing the upset face of his granddaughter, decided to give another idea. Better yet, go to the library. It's a good one here. Here, now I'll write you a list of books to look at there. I'm thinking of writing a book on local folklore. So you, look and bring these. Such a case could not be called particularly exciting. But firstly, Angelica, it seemed much more interesting than sitting at home. And secondly, the girl mentally again scolded herself for the fact that even ranted. And so she decided to bring what her grandfather needed. And as soon as he came back, to do, in fact, lunch. The library turned out to be exactly as Angelica had expected, small but very cozy. The smell of books was joined by the scent of fresh wood, recently renovated. When she had finished with the formalities of signing in as a new reader, Angelica wandered among the shelves, stopping occasionally to take down a book, open it, and then put it back. She didn't feel like reading at all, so she decided to just quickly pick up whatever her grandfather had told her to bring. "Ouch," said the girl when she pulled one of the books, but it did not yield. Then she pulled harder and the volume slipped off the shelf, and behind it was found a man, so it happened by chance that at the same time they wanted to take the same copy. "Hello," said Angelica and smiled, because the other visitor in the empty library at that hour was Alexander. "It seems that we have already changed to the first name," he smiled. "Yes, sorry, I'm sorry." The girl was completely confused and hastily handed him a book. "Take it. I think you were the first to take it." "It's okay," he refused. "I was just looking for something to read on local legends, and you seem to be collecting a list," he nodded, his eyes pointing at the sheet clutched in Angelica's hand. "My grandfather sent me. And what do you need it for?" "For myself, for the book." "Are you a historian too?" Angelica was surprised. "No, I'm a writer, and I'm working on something. I decided not to waste time while I'm resting here." "Maybe. Can you recommend some literature?" "I'm looking for a werewolf book." "That's for Grandpa," Angelica answered immediately. "I don't read that kind of stuff. I don't like horror stories." "Oh, you're missing a lot," Alexander winked. "It is natural in human nature to strive for safe fear, and that's what we experience when we read appropriate literature or watch movies." "No," confidently continued to refuse Angelica. "I somehow and in life," she awkwardly coughed. "By the way, and maybe, really, on Tito has come over." "Maybe," the guy seemed to answer simply, but there was something infinitely stubborn in his voice, as if he was never going to come to visit. But he did come. That same day, he showed up at 7 o'clock in the evening with a bouquet of flowers and a cake. "Oh, this is unnecessary," Angelica said embarrassedly, taking the bouquet. "Oh, what do you think?" Alexander jokingly replied, going into the house. "I brought the cake just in case. What if you are a terrible cook?" Winked at the girl. Angelica almost choked with indignation, but then, appreciating the impertinent joke, grinned. "I do serve a birch bark pie to harmful guests, but such pretty blondes can count on something better." Grandpa greeted the guests friendly, but without any jokes. They sat down to drink tea and the conversation began. It turned out that Alexander came to Cabanchichi to rest from the bustle of the city and at the same time in such favorable, inspiring conditions to work on some of his literary projects. He was 24 years old. He had recently graduated from the Faculty of Philology and was going to devote his life to literature, not only as a writer, but also as an editor, and the guy planned to work in a publishing house. Alexander generously told about himself, except for his family. He got off with general phrases about the fact that his father and mother are no longer in the world, and naturally, after this, neither Angelica nor Robert did not begin to ask about anything else. And then, somehow so imperceptibly, it turned out that Alexander and Angelica began to see each other more and more often. They were, in fact, meetings of friends. It turned out that Alexander knew only a little less about the local area than Grandpa Robert. Alexander showed Angelica an amazingly beautiful forest lake, and although now it was completely out of season, but from his words she easily and vividly imagined how in early summer it is covered with lily flowers. The guy invited her to go down into a small cave. Even more likely it was a grotto, but Angelica flatly refused and panicked. And he also did not hide the fact that she tries not to go out after sunset. And one day he asked her directly, "Are you afraid of the dark? Why do you say that?" Angelica answered as if indifferently, but her heart froze, because it seemed to her just nightmarish if the guy she had already begun to like so much and with whom she spent more time than with any man she had ever known before found out about such a stupid, just shameful fear of her. It was just a thought. Angelica snorted indignantly and hurried to change the subject. But gradually their meetings began to take on a slightly different character than it could be with friends. Alexander began to look for opportunities to touch her more often. Angelica, without understanding why, but avoided it, somehow shrunk into a lump ball. And once when he saw her off and parted already on the porch of her house, Alexander reached for her face, fingertips outlined her cheekbone and went down to her chin. He said nothing, but came closer. "No," the girl exclaimed and turned away abruptly. Her head was pulled into her shoulders, her palms pressed into the shoulders, pushing away. Angelica did not know that in those moments Alexander managed to read in her eyes fear mixed with disgust, and he realized that these feelings did not apply to him, and he wanted to tear to shreds the one who dared to hurt the one who became indifferent to him. Alexander swore to himself that he would not hesitate to find out who Angelica had met before, and then he would find out who treated her unworthily. But right now he pretended that everything was fine, and simply, as if nothing had happened to say goodbye, left. One day the girl came home from the store and, sorting out her purchases, began to recount to her grandfather the conversation she had with the saleswoman. It was an ordinary, in fact, meaningless chatter until Angelica mentioned that according to the sales clerk, Alexander really liked to vacation here. Just a few years ago came with his father Billy. What? Grandpa asked the question so sharply and in such a tone that Angelica jumped and almost dropped the carton of eggs, which she was going to put in the refrigerator. "Well, I told you that Alexander is here with his father." "Say his last name again. You said Billy." "Yes," nodded the girl, not understanding at all what the matter was. "You mustn't see him again," Robert said and sat down on a chair, putting his hand to his chest. He was having trouble breathing. "Oh, that's it. The creature." "Grandfather." Angelica was frightened on several occasions at once, both that her grandfather was ill and that he had reacted in such a way to the mere mention of Father Alexander's name. "Are you sick, doctor?" "No, granddaughter." The old man wrinkled his nose. "Everything is fine. No need for a doctor. I'm not quite decrepit yet. And as for that young man, you mustn't see him again, do you hear?" "But..." Angelique blinked a lot. "Why?" Robert looked at his granddaughter carefully. He shook his head. "Sweetheart, just trust me. It's better this way." "But we have," began Angelica suddenly. "We are with him. He called me. On a date." "What?" Grandpa started to get up, but then he sat back down. "That's it. No, it's impossible." "But why? Did he do something wrong? Why are you forbidding me like a little girl? I'm an adult and I can do what I want." "No, as long as I'm alive, you can't see him. Barry's son can't be a good man." "So this is about his father." Angelica finally figured it out. "Did you two know each other?" Robert got up at last. He came closer and put his trembling hands on Angelica's shoulders. "Yes, granddaughter, Billy. That was the name of the man who... That's your father. Billy is the thug who crippled your mom's life. Alexander is his son, which means he's your brother." Angelique felt like the air in the room had run out. It had just been there and then it was gone. Instead of it spilled flames. And it now hit her chest with a heavy wave, making her gasp, look around panic-stricken. The girl waited in panic when she would lose consciousness, fall awkwardly on the floor. Yes, she would fall and hit, but for some reason it was not happening. What was said simply could not be reality, no. That her Alexander, that man who could so easily make her laugh, whose innocent touch awakened a storm of feelings, he turned out to be her brother? That's impossible. It's wrong. It shouldn't have happened like this. The evening and night, in which Angelica barely closed her eyes on the verge of dawn, seemed to her an agonizing eternity. Again and again she asked her grandfather how could it be? Could it be a different Billy? But he answered that no, it was. After all, this man, who was mentioned in the store conversation, many people remembered here until now, He heard the whole neighborhood in fear. Angelica did not know what to think. She suddenly remembered how Alexander had scared those guys in the car away from her. They so backed off. Can it be that appearance and impressions all turned out to be deceptive? That his father raised Alexander to be a copy of himself, and he's just as much of a monster? And also Angelica could not understand. Did Alexander himself know about it? Did Alexander know that his father was a bandit? And although her grandfather ordered and practically begged her not to see him anymore, Angelica decided to do her own thing. And the next day, she went to the place where they agreed to meet outside the village, near the forest edge, where the field began, from which the ride had recently been taken off. Seeing Alexander approaching, the girl got up from the stump where she had been sitting before and clasped her hands. "Hi," said the guy and frowned, noticing her face with such an expression, which mixed fear, disgust, and hope. He had never seen her before. Angelica decided to deal with it quickly. "I was told your father's name was Billy. Is that true?" He was a gangster, wasn't he?" Alexander was taken aback. He hadn't expected this conversation. Or rather, he hadn't expected it to happen so soon and in such an uncomfortable way when he wasn't the one setting the tone. Yes, Billy was doing business, not quite legally. He'd been punished for it, and then went back to business without a mistake. Mistakes. Angelica gasped and took a step back. "So you call the dirt and blood on his hands mistakes?" "Angelica, calm down. I didn't put it that way. I only meant to say that at the end Oh, at the end. I'm more interested in how it all started. Your father," the girl sobbed. My mom." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment and then, opening them, looked, as it seemed to Angelica, into her heart. "I know. Angelica, listen, I have so much to tell you. There's a lot you don't know. And So you do know?" She exhaled. "Do you know that you are my brother?" said the girl in a colorless voice. "You are my brother. You knew that too, man. You asked me out. You almost kissed me then. How could you? How could you?" Angelica felt nauseous. A suffocating, viscous lump of it seemed to flood her entire being. And it was a feeling she knew well. She had experienced it when her stepfather had attacked her. "Grandfather was right," the girl sobbed. "Angelica, I'll explain everything. I don't." The boy started, but Angelica, having shrieked briefly, didn't let him finish and slapped her cheek with the palm of her hand. Angelica had never hit anyone before, and it became so hard. It seemed that inside now breaks off, burns out something infinitely valuable, which will never come back. "I hate you. I hate you. Don't you dare come near me." Choking on her tears, Angelica retreated. "Never. Do you hear me? Never." And she ran. The wind blew in her face. The weather began to deteriorate, and from the horizon floated rapidly, carried fluffy monstrous thunderclouds. Alexander did not rush after her. He stayed where he was. He just didn't know. He didn't know how to say that she just didn't know the whole truth, and that they could be together. There's no obstacle to that. She just didn't want to hear about it. He was also distracted by a phone call. It was a call from a man whom Alexander had instructed to solve an important issue, and from the first words, as he answered it, it became clear that everything was much worse than he thought. Already approaching the house, Angelica began to suffer a bad feeling. The girl froze when she saw a white ambulance in the yard, and then rushed forward, as far as breath and strength after running from heartless, disgusting betrayal. "Grandfather? Grandpa!" screamed the girl, rushing toward the stretcher that was being loaded into the car. "What happened?" "Are you his granddaughter, Angelica?" asked the doctor, who caught her carefully. "He called for you." "It's okay. He's alive." "A heart attack. He needs to be hospitalized. You can come with us." The young doctor spoke quickly and clearly, keeping eye contact with the distraught girl. Yes, Angelica nodded. Of course he wanted to come, and so scared for dear beloved grandfather that all other problems, his own broken heart, all receded into the background. In the end, after the grandfather was in the ward of the hospital of the district center under the careful supervision of doctors, Angelica had to go back, with great difficulty, but the doctors managed to persuade her that spending the night in the hospital is not the best idea. Besides, the patient needed to bring some necessary personal belongings from home. And only when she went outside, Angelica realized that she had neither money nor even a cell phone with her. And meanwhile, it was getting darker and darker. Wow, what people! A car with guys from the village slowed down near her. "It's cold to look at you," smirked the one who sat in the driver's seat. Angelica was surprised to realize that it was really cold, and she was wearing a light dress, which she had chosen in the morning, when the weather was still wonderful and warm in summer. "Are you waiting for the streetcar?" the guy in the back seat asked snidely, but immediately received a poke in the side from his buddy. "Stop laughing. Can't you see something's wrong with her?" He leaned out the window. "What's wrong?" Angelica did not like to cry in front of strangers, but here she burst into tears and said that her grandfather became ill, and she did not know how to return home. "So this, get in, we'll give you a ride." The driver waved an inviting hand. "Well, if you're not afraid, like last time, we're honest. We're not evil people." Angelica nodded. She thought that she had made a mistake once before. She thought that Alexander was a good guy. She had fallen for how nice he was, and it turned out. So now she opened the door without fear and climbed into the back seat. The two guys had to squeeze in. On the way, they exchanged a few phrases. The guys introduced themselves as Max, the driver Mickey, the one who had asked about the streetcar, Harvey, and Steve. And then one of them mentioned Alexander in the conversation. Angelica asked that this was a man she didn't want to talk about at all. "Did they have a fight? I thought you two were like that. Dating." Harvey said, "Well, it's common knowledge in the village." "No, it's nothing like that." Angelica burst into flames. "He's not at all what I thought he was. He's a terrible man." "Is that Alexander?" Max marveled sincerely. "Well, you women honestly do not understand. You want bad guys. You don't like who would refuse it." When Barry got out of crime, he became a businessman. He made a lot of money, and then he died, just like his friend in the accident. It's mystical. And then there was a lot of noise that Barry gave everything to this kid in his will. He was a regular guy, but now he's a millionaire. Obviously, everyone was wondering why, so they started talking. Barry lived his whole life alone. He had women, but only for a while. He changed them like foreign cars. I guess he realized later that he hadn't had time to have children. Mickey joined in the story again. They started saying Alexander was Barry's son. Blood. Well, as if he'd had an affair with his friend's wife once, and then, in order not to ruin the family, kept everything secret. So it turned out that somehow everyone here decided that Alexander was the heir of that bandit, and that was it. Well, at first, we'd also thought that hair came, we would all go under bandits again. But then we talked to him and it became clear that Alexander is not engaged in any such business. He is as pure as snow. And what they say, well, what difference does it make? Whether he's Barry's son or not? Barry's like a second father to him. He helped him get back on his feet. "Oh, we've had a good talk," Steve said, nodding toward the road, where the village loomed ahead. "Well, we got you there. Well, you..." Angelica got out of the car as if in a trance. And her head did not fit all that she heard now. "In general, we told you everything as it is," summarized Max. "Bye," and the car drove off. Angelica walked through the yard to the house. The meager, milky white moonlight was chasing dry autumn leaves. Some twigs crunched under her feet, and the girl distantly thought about the fact that the garden was in such disrepair. It would be necessary to put everything in order. Angelica did not allow herself to think that something terrible could happen to her grandfather. "Grandpa Robert is a tough guy. He'll be fine. He'll live to be 100. Forcing herself to smile, Angelica walked up the porch and stopped in front of the door. I think she locked it when she left in a hurry in the ambulance. If such a return to the house with unlocked doors had happened to her before, she would have been terrified. But the past events had thrown her into a strange state of mind, and she acted as if she were acting machine-like, without thinking. And only when the door closed and the hallway was plunged into darkness, Angelica woke up, shrieked quietly, and tapped her hand on the wall in search of a switch. "Where is it?" "Where?" "I found it." Something rustled, and Angelica did not immediately realize that it was the wind howling outside the windows. And until the light flashed brightly in the hallway, Angelica stood there and her gaze hysterically darted around the corners, the floor. Fear, that almost childish hidden, spread its paws, crawled out inexorably, but it was chased away by the light. The girl even began to laugh right about her grandfather said, "Well, what nonsense. There's nothing like that in the dark." Angelica in general lately began to think that she was not afraid of anything. She was less afraid of the dark. And the memories of her stepfather and his ugly hands faded. Everything was getting better until she learned the truth about Alexander. Angelica shook her head. What on earth was that supposed to mean? He might not be her brother, but what does that change? Does it change everything? Or should she not be foolishly naive? Because how could a man like Barry have good friends? Could a normal young man who agreed to live and build his life, in fact, under the patronage of this monster? Angelica shook her head though. She was thinking about the wrong thing. After all, right now she had other things to do. To collect the things that her grandfather would need at the hospital. Also to inform his friends what happened. Plus, of course, to prepare a home-cooked meal. These were all things Angelica decided to do early in the morning. The girl smiled, imagining how she would surprise her grandfather with his favorite zucchini pancakes. Only it is necessary not to fry them, and it is better to bake them in the oven. She went to her room and set her alarm clock for 7 in the morning. Then she took a shower and changed into her favorite warm pajamas. The girl reached for the bedside table to turn on the night light. She had already resigned herself to the fact that she would probably sleep with at least some light on for the rest of her life. But her hand found only a void. Angelica frowned and dropped it on the floor. She looked around, behind the nightstand and under the bed. The nightlight was nowhere to be found, but she definitely remembered it being here. Grandpa would never move her things without asking, and why would he? Suddenly the light in the room went out. Angelica gasped and hurriedly grabbed the phone. Hurry! The bright light of the tiny flashlight built into it cut through the darkness. She stepped out into the hallway. There didn't seem to be any light anywhere. None of the switches had tripped. Angelica sighed. This was such a thunderstorm. She felt uncomfortable. Would she really have to spend the night like this, leaving her phone on until morning? She glanced at the battery image and just clutched her head, ran her fingers through her hair and squeezed it nervously. There was only one division left in green. The phone was practically dead, and since there was no electricity, that meant it was about to go out. But before panic set in, she remembered that in the kitchen, in the sick closet, the most ordinary candles and matches should be kept, which meant everything would be fine. She would be left in total darkness. It was only a short walk to the kitchen, and in order not to be so frightened, because the darkness was too much around, Angelica quietly began to hum a song. A beautiful voice, my little one. The girl stopped as if she had hit a wall. Her body stiffened. No, not with fear. It was a different feeling. Hard, all-encompassing, paralyzing. She breathed often. Did you miss your daddy? Angelica glanced away, then found the strength to turn around. Her stepfather stood about 4 feet away from her on the threshold of the next room, the living room, lit sparingly by the moon, which had finally emerged as a gray disk through the gaps in the rain clouds. What? How? The words stuck in my throat, my tongue refusing to utter them. Did you think your old man would save you? My stepfather smirked, or rather grinned. Not hiding the pleasure, but not delaying it. He told his stepdaughter how it was, how he came to his senses in the morning, beaten, humiliated. For a few days it was all the same, where the little trash and the old man disappeared. But then different thoughts began to come, and then a man contacted him, called the lawyer who represents Robert's interests. He said that Robert intends to sell the apartment. And I thought, continued the stepfather, what does that mean? Me, the breadwinner of the family, on the street. All Angelica grew up, big became, and that's it. Do not need a man in the house. Thinks she will live on her own. She's so big. Well, what are your eyes bulging? Stepfather stepped forward. You grandfather, began Angelica, but he interrupted. You're a fool, Angelica. No, it was different. I've been here a long time. I've been looking after you. Well, it's a nice house. Expensive, I suppose. And you were so poor. Well, we'll fix everything, he muttered quietly, thinking something over, and smiled at her again in a nasty way. He looked at her from top to bottom as if he were groping her. "You're hiding in your pajamas like a sack. You should put on a nightgown, or even better, stockings." Angelica shook. She shook her head. "No," she whispered, feeling tears forming in her eyes. "I was just thinking," the stepfather continued, and took another step. "How fortunate it all turned out. The old man's gone. You and I, sweetie, alone. It's a long night. We'll have time to talk, and you'll have time then to sign over your share of the apartment." It was only here that Angelique realized her mistake. She should have run to the street and then to the village. Of course, there, on the road, there would be nowhere to hide. But what prevents his stepfather now go looking for him? And the girl also thought that now it was time to call for help, but the phone suddenly went out of battery. Whimpering, Angelica shook it as if that would revive the battery. In this room, there was also a little light coming through the window. Angelica could see the table, a large armchair with a carved back. This was where Grandpa wanted to make an office, and suddenly her eyes caught on the bag, her grandfather's second travel bag, which had disturbed her on the train. It took Angelica only a few moments to remember what was stored there and how it could help her. Meanwhile, behind the door, somewhere in the corridor, John's drunken shouts and the sounds of doors opening were heard. He was checking the rooms, looking for her. And there was no doubt that sooner or later, and most likely not too late, he would reach this one. Could there be another way out? Angelica ran to the window, opened it, but second floor. She was just afraid to jump down. There weren't even any bushes that could theoretically cushion the fall, only the stonework in this part of the courtyard. Angelica cried again. Freedom is so close and she can't get it. Meanwhile, judging by the sounds, her stepfather had busied himself with checking the room across the hall. Trying not to make any noise now, Angelica grabbed the bag. She opened it, opened the box. Naturally, it was impossible to handle such a tool as this trapped silently. The girl had time to curse herself. Well, where would she get the strength and in general, how to handle this thing? The trap had no teeth, and so Angelica could act more boldly, sharper, without fear of injury. Finally, it opened with a rattle. How she did it and did not realize it herself, just worked with her hands, turning off her head. And the next moment, the trap was on the floor near the door, and Angelica herself snuck away, lurking behind the closet, just in time. The door slowly opened. "Where are you, little girl? You know, I don't like hiding. Come out yourself, or it'll be worse." The last word turned into a shrill cry of pain as John's foot caught in the trap. He just didn't see it, because when he entered the room, he was shining the flashlight in front of him, not down below. Angelica lunged straight at her stepfather, dodged, but felt his fingers trying to grab her leg. Shit. John sent a couple more curses after her. The first wave of pain was gone, and his body had little sense of reality after the drink. The man realized that his leg didn't seem to be broken. John dug his hands into the brackets and pulled them apart. How did the damn thing open? How did it get in here in the first place? And how did Angelica, the weak, fearful Angelica, know how to do it? How dare she? After vividly imagining what he'd do to her when he got there, John finally managed to free the limb. He groaned through clenched teeth as he stood up, and decided he would never let the girl live for this. Angelica ran through the dark house, and for the first time this darkness did not frighten her. Now all the horror, all the fears, all the nightmare that could only exist for her in the universe, embodied in her stepfather. The girl was descending the stairs, had already put her foot down on the last bottom step, when suddenly the foot in the slipper awkwardly led sideways. Shrieking, Angelica fell down, bumping her elbow painfully. Gasping for breath, she got up and ran into something. Strong arms embraced her, lifting her above the floor. The girl screamed, struggling to break free. "Angelica, it's okay. Angelica, it's me." The familiar voice had a better effect in an instant than if the light had suddenly turned on. The light, by the way, was coming from the street through the open door, and it was coming from the flashlight dropped on the floor by the one who was holding her. Angelica stared at Alexander's face, opening her mouth helplessly. For some reason she couldn't speak. Finally, she squeezed out hoarsely. "Your stepfather." Alexander nodded, then bent down, picked up the flashlight, and holding Angelica under his arm, led her to the door. "Come on, I'd already called for help." But she couldn't take a step. Her ankle was pierced by pain. Alexander picked her up in his arms and carried her out of the house. His car was just outside the yard gate. "What? How did you?" Angelica clung to him, clung desperately as he set her on the ground and then, opening the door to the front passenger seat, helped her into the car. "I'll tell you later," he replied sternly. "Stay here." "Where are you going?" "No." Angelica was horrified when she realized that Alexander was walking back to the house. "It's all right," he turned to her. "But he mustn't go. He can't get away with this." "A trap," Angelica said hurriedly, wrapping her arms around her shoulders. "I said a trap." "What?" the boy asked in surprise. "Where did you? Are there traps in the house?" "One. Grandfather's. I put it in the room he came in and he got caught with his foot." "What have I done?" Alexander came back, leaned toward her. His palms rested on the girl's face, forcing her to raise her head and look into his eyes. "Don't worry, everything will be all right. Just be here." Much later, returning in memories to the events of that night and the next day, Angelica wondered how all of them, starting from the moment when Alexander took her out of the house in his arms, were put together in one brief segment, as if cutting fragments from a movie in which she, by the will of an evil fate, was destined to play the main role. The stepfather was too drunk and clumsy. He ran into Alexander at the top of the stairs, but he almost fell down and the guy easily managed to pull him to the floor and tie the villain's hands with his own belt from his pants. And then came the help. It turned out that Robert's grandfather in the village was a lot of old acquaintances. Someone visited him in the hospital, and of course, because of the visitors was nothing to think about, even a little time to keep what happened in secret. Angelica only tried to soften the whole picture, to disturb her grandfather less, but to her amazement he only said that she was a good girl, and on the part in which the trap was involved, and laughed at all, and so that the nurse looked in to find out what happened. "Nothing," he said, wiping the tears from his eyes. "Here, I had a memorabilia with a history, a trap antique. They said they used to catch werewolves with it. Well, such a legend, but here's how it turned out. Also, a kind of werewolf, my granddaughter caught a creature that pretended to be a man, and our family soul entered. Oh, what a story. It turns out I've kept this junk all these years for a reason." John was furious that his plan had failed. He did not hesitate in expressions in everyone he saw, talking about how he hates stepdaughter, what a bad girl she is. Finally, it became clear that he had a problem with his head. John would suddenly start sobbing and say that it was him. He was the victim. Because while he was sitting there in the darkness of the house, while he was walking through it wounded, he had suffered all sorts of things. He swore on his life that Alexander, who had grabbed him, had eyes that burned with fire and claws on his hands, that he smelled of wet dog and had fangs in his mouth that glistened in the moonlight. He was also afraid now, hysterical if he was in the dark. John had been declared insane. "You won't see him again," Alexander said, and hugged Angelica, gently and tenderly, so tightly that it was easy to feel the desire to shelter his beloved from the world. He told her that some time ago he had become aware that his stepfather was looking for Angelica. Alexander learned that John had come to the village, and while the stepfather was watching the girl, he himself was being watched. Alexander wanted to wait a moment and have a serious talk with this man, threaten him, but here it turned out he missed it. At some point, he got word that John had gone somewhere. At first, he thought that John had left the village, but when he realized where he had gone, he barely managed to save Angelica. And almost immediately, the day after the rescue, Alexander clarified the most important thing. He said he was not related to Barry by blood. He'd had doubts about that, even when the family friend had called him over. He told Billy himself honestly about it, admitted that the rumors had raised doubts. And to dispel them, he suggested a paternity test. And it turned out that the rumors were just rumors. And Alexander also told that in confidential conversations, his patron expressed regrets that much in his life has done wrong, a lot of evil. Robert, after Alexander saved Angelica, changed his opinion of him and added that during his illness, he had plenty of time to think about everything. "I was wrong," Robert said firmly. "Just because Barry was his family doesn't say that Alexander himself is bad. After all, John was in our family. They are different things after all. Alexander objected suddenly. I took him in willingly, and you and your granddaughter were forced to live like this. But I'm grateful that you're giving me a chance. I just see how you have changed Angelica, Robert grinned. She has blossomed with you. Anyway, since there is no other elder relative, I personally give the go-ahead for your marriage. Grandfather, Angelica exclaimed. We do not. You beat me to it, Alexander smiled. I was going to propose to Angelica, but apparently now there will be no surprise. But the essence won't change, will it? With these words, Alexander knelt down on the floor and took out a scarlet velvet box from his pocket and opened it in front of Angelica. I am not good at long, beautiful speeches, probably because I'm more used to writing books. I just want to say that I love you. I guess that's what they call love at first sight. I want us to be together forever, and I'm willing to do anything for that. Angelica listened, and it seemed to her that all this was not happening to her. And at the same time, they did not doubt the truthfulness of Alexander's words. I agree, the girl answered quietly, and the next moment on her finger was a ring with a large, transparent and shining, like a dewdrop, diamond. In addition to Robert's grandfather, there were other patients in the room, and they, who had been quiet, but had been watching with great interest, suddenly began to say congratulations, and some of them even clapped their hands. A nurse, now displeased with the double, looked in again, but when she heard the cause of the commotion, she could not remain indifferent to it. After Robert recovered, of course, they talked about the future. If earlier grandfather was going to sell the apartment in order to make his granddaughter a single room and to buy a room for his old age, probably with the same lonely old people, now there was no need for this. Alexander was sufficiently provided for Robert to keep his home. But that was not all. Angelica's future husband insisted that the house in Kabankiki should be put in the best possible condition, providing it with the best modern renovations, but necessarily one in which the house could retain its unique original style. Grandfather was right. Alexander's society continued to influence Angelique in the best possible way, and by the time they were married, she had rid herself of the heavy burden of past memories. The night after the wedding, when it was time for bed, Alexander smiled at his young wife and asked if she should leave the light on for the night. No, replied Angelica with a smile. Now I am no longer afraid of the dark, because I have you. Soon after the wedding, the girl realized her dream of entering the same faculty that her grandfather had once studied. Robert said that of course he would definitely help her with her studies, and Alexander published his book, a collection of legends about werewolves. And although his wife still didn't like the scary books and movies her husband sometimes entertained herself with, she read his book and said it was terribly interesting.